in the shadows of history, one empire stood apart, an empire that outlived Rome itself, and for over 1,000 years held the fate of Europe in its hands. This was Byzantium, a land of emperors crowned in gold, of warriors who fought under the sign of the cross, and of traders who sold secrets for silver in the dead of night. At its heart stood Constantinople, the city of walls and wonders, where holy relics glimmered in candlelight, where domes of gold touched the heavens, and where conspiracies brewed in hidden chambers. Here, the sacred and the sinister lived side by side. The Byzantine Empire was an empire of survival, forged in blood, bound by faith, and constantly tested by enemies on all sides. Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, and finally, the Ottomans, all came to break its walls. Yet still, it endured, until one final night, in 1453, when fire and steel swallowed the Golden City forever. This is not just a story of kings and battles. It is a tale of betrayal, of faith that divided as much as it united, and of a civilization whose echoes still shape the world today. Welcome to Dark History. If you crave the secrets, the mysteries, and the untold truths of our past, make sure to subscribe and press the bell icon so you never miss what lies hidden in the shadows. The story of the Byzantine Empire begins now. Chapter 1. The Ghost of Rome. The Roman Empire had fallen, or so the world believed, in the year 476 AD, when the barbarian warlord Odoacer cast aside the last emperor of the West, a boy mockingly nicknamed Romulus, It seemed as though 1,000 years of power had collapsed into dust. Rome, the eternal city, once the beating heart of the world, was reduced to ruins. Its forums crumbled, its aqueducts decayed, and its once proud senate was little more than an echo of former glory. To many, the empire was dead, but it was not far to the east. In lands richer than the barren West could ever dream, an empire endured. It claimed the same lineage, bore the same titles, and kept alive the flickering flame of Rome's majesty. Its rulers called themselves emperors of the Romans, and its citizens referred to themselves as Romans. Yet, this was no longer the Rome of Caesar, of Trajan, or of Marcus Aurelius. This was something else, something new, something forged in blood and survival. The world would later call it the Byzantine Empire, but the people living in its marble palaces and bustling markets never accepted that name. To them, they were Rome itself, reborn. Still, they were haunted by the memory of what had been lost, haunted by the ghost of Rome. A world on fire. The 5th century was not an age of stability, but of collapse. The Western Roman Empire had bled itself dry. Its armies, once unmatched in discipline, had become shadows of their former selves, filled with mercenaries who turned against their masters. The barbarians had not only breached the empire's borders, they had settled within them, carving out kingdoms where Roman legions once marched. The Visigoths plundered Gaul and Spain. The Vandals seized North Africa. The Ostrogoths claimed Italy itself. Rome, once the mistress of the world, had become prey. Its people had watched in horror as the Visigoth king Alaric sacked their city in 410, and later, as the Vandals stormed it again in 455. The eternal city trembled under flames. Its streets were filled with silence, where once senators debated and soldiers paraded. By the time Odoacer ended the western line of emperors, there was little left to save. Yet in the east, the empire held on. Why? The answer lay in wealth, strategy, and a city that would become legendary. Constantinople, the immortal city, founded in 330 AD by Constantine the Great, the first Christian emperor. Constantinople was no ordinary city. It was a fortress of stone and sea, built on the edge of Europe and Asia, straddling two continents, controlling the narrow strait of the Bosphorus. Its location was genius. It guarded the passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, commanded the trade routes of East and West, and was nearly impregnable. 3 mighty walls ringed the city, stretching across its landward side. Tower after tower rose skyward, and behind them lay hidden gates, secret passages, and killing grounds designed to break the morale of any besieging army. Attackers would later say that storming Constantinople was like trying to conquer a mountain made of iron on its seaward side. The city was shielded by the waters of the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara, where the Byzantine navy lurked, ready to unleash a terrifying weapon the world would come to fear. Greek fire, a burning liquid that clung to water and flesh alike, impossible to extinguish. Inside its walls, Constantinople was a wonder. Its streets overflowed with merchants from every corner of the known world, Arabs selling spices, Persians trading silk, Slavs offering furs, Africans carrying ivory and gold. Towering over all was the great hippodrome, an arena where tens of thousands gathered to cheer, riot, or bleed for their factions, the blues and the greens. And at the city's heart, Constantine had built churches, palaces, and forums meant to rival Rome itself. But more than walls and markets, Constantinople was built on faith. Constantine had turned the empire toward Christianity, and his city became the New Jerusalem, a holy capital for a Christian Rome. Crosses gleamed above its domes, hymns echoed through its streets, and relics of saints were carried in solemn processions. In time, it would cradle one of the most breathtaking wonders of the medieval world, the Hagia Sophia, a cathedral of such size and beauty that even centuries later, enemies would gasp at its magnificence. Constantinople was not simply a city, it was a statement. Rome may have fallen, but here, the empire endures. Survival in shadows and endure, it did, but not easily. The emperors of the East faced the same storms that had destroyed the West. From the north came waves of Huns and Slavs. From the east, the ancient Persians of the Sassanid dynasty, and from within, the poison of treachery and court intrigue. In Byzantium, the throne was not a seat of honor, it was a seat of execution. Emperors ruled by God's will, yet their reigns were often measured in years, sometimes only months, before they were poisoned, strangled, or mutilated by rivals. Byzantine politics was as dangerous as any battlefield. To survive in the palace was to learn the art of deceit. A smile could hide a dagger, a prayer could mask a plot. Eunuchs whispered in corridors, generals schemed on battlefields, and monks stirred the people with sermons that could spark riots, and riots were frequent. The people of Constantinople were as dangerous as its enemies. The factions of the Hippodrome, the Blues and the Greens, were more than sports teams. They were political forces, capable of turning the streets into rivers of fire. One emperor would soon discover this firsthand, when the Nika riots would nearly burn the city to the ground. But that is a tale for another chapter. Between two worlds, Byzantium was never fully Roman, nor fully Greek. It lived between identities. Latin remained the language of law and the army, but Greek filled the markets, schools, and homes. Roman law dictated justice, yet Greek philosophy guided thought. The emperors called themselves Caesars and Augusti, but they wrapped themselves in Christian authority, declaring themselves chosen by God. This tension gave Byzantium a strange duality. It was old and new, pagan past and Christian present, Rome's heir and its stranger. Outsiders often misunderstood it, labeling it decadent, corrupt, or effeminate. But beneath the gilded ceremonies, Byzantium was forged from iron. It was pragmatic, cunning, and ruthlessly determined to survive. When brute force could not win, Byzantium bribed. When armies failed, spies succeeded. When enemies marched, the empire bought them off or turned them against one another. This was diplomacy as warfare, deception as survival. To many, it seemed cowardly. To the Byzantines, it was genius. The curse of Rome, but survival came at a cost. The ghost of Rome lingered. The Byzantines looked westward, with both longing and sorrow. The fallen provinces of Italy, Gaul, Spain, and North Africa were reminders of what had been lost. The emperors of Constantinople dreamed of reclaiming that glory, of reuniting the empire under their rule. But every dream carried a shadow. To seek the West meant endless war, endless blood, and the risk of losing what little remained secure. For now, survival was enough. But a day would come when one emperor ambitious, relentless, and determined would gamble everything to restore Rome. His name was Justinian, and his reign would burn as brightly as the sun before nearly destroying the empire in fire and plague. The ghost whispers Byzantium endured, but it endured uneasily. The empire was not yet the mighty force that would dazzle the medieval world with its wealth and power. It was still fragile, still untested, still haunted by collapse. Every day, the people of Constantinople lived with the knowledge that their enemies watched, waiting. The Persians to the east, the barbarians to the north. The deserts to the south each threatened to consume what remained of Rome, and yet the city stood. Its walls rose defiant. Its markets bustled with life. Its churches thundered with faith. Against the tide of chaos, Constantinople remained a lighthouse in the storm. But every ghost carries a curse, and as the 5th century faded, the empire would learn that survival was not enough. To endure truly, it would need vision, courage, and above all, ambition. For soon, the Eastern Roman Empire would find itself tested in ways no one could imagine. New leaders would rise, some crowned in glory, others drowned in blood, and with them, Byzantium would begin its long, perilous journey through history and empire, both immortal and doomed. And so, as the shadow of Rome lingered over Constantinople's marble walls, the stage was set for the rise of one of the most remarkable rulers the world had ever seen. Justinian. Chapter 2. Constantine the Great and the Birth of Byzantium. The story of the Byzantine Empire cannot be told without first pausing to examine one man, a figure who strode across history like a colossus, Constantine the Great. His decisions, his ambitions, and his vision would lay the foundations for what would become one of the most enduring and complex civilizations the world had ever known. Without Constantine, there would be no Byzantium, no glittering mosaics in Hagia Sophia, no Eastern Roman Empire lasting for 1,000 years. To understand Byzantium, we must first understand the man who gave it life. Constantine was born around the year 272 CE in Nessus, a town in the Roman province of Mysia, in modern-day Serbia. His father, Constantius Chlorus, was a capable Roman general who rose to the rank of Caesar under the Tetrarchy, the system of divided imperial rule created by Emperor Diocletian. His mother Helena came from humbler origins, yet she would later be revered as Saint Helena, a woman whose piety and influence on her son left an indelible mark on the empire's spiritual destiny. Constantine grew up in an age when the Roman Empire was fractured, plagued by civil wars, and threatened by both internal corruption and external invasion. He was a child of instability, and this turbulence shaped his worldview. The Tetrarchy, established to bring order, instead fostered rivalry, for rulers shared power, but suspicion and ambition made peace fragile. In this volatile atmosphere, Constantine rose as a man of military skill, shrewd calculation, and unyielding ambition. When his father died in 306 CE in Britain, the legions proclaimed Constantine emperor. Yet his claim was contested. What followed was years of civil wars, alliances, betrayals, and bloody battles. As rival emperors clashed for control of Rome, Constantine was not merely a participant in these struggles, he was their master, a general who knew how to inspire loyalty and seize the opportune moment. The most decisive moment came in 312 CE, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. On the eve of battle against his rival Maxentius, Constantine experienced a vision that would alter the course of history. Ancient sources differ on the details, but they converge on the central claim. Constantine saw a sign in the heavens. Some describe it as a cross of light above the sun, accompanied by the words in hoc signo vinces, in this sign, you will conquer. Others speak of a dream in which Christ instructed him to mark his soldiers' shields with the chiro, the monogram of Christ. Whatever the exact truth, Constantine was convinced he had received divine aid. His troops marched into battle bearing the new Christian symbol, and they won a stunning victory. Maxentius was slain, and Constantine entered Rome as its undisputed master. From that moment, Constantine's reign took on a new character. He was still a pragmatic politician, but he was also a man who believed himself chosen by divine will. He ended the persecution of Christians with the Edict of Milan in 313, granting religious tolerance throughout the empire. This act was revolutionary. For 3 centuries, Christians had lived under the threat of imprisonment, torture, and death. Now, overnight, they were free to worship openly. The persecuted faith would not only survive but thrive, climbing from the shadows of catacombs to the heights of imperial power. Constantine, though not baptized until his deathbed, became the first emperor to openly embrace Christianity, forever binding his name to the faith's triumph. Yet Constantine's vision extended beyond religion. He knew that Rome itself, glorious though it was, no longer served as a fitting capital. The Eternal City had become a place of political intrigue, old pagan traditions, and geographical disadvantage. The empire's wealth and strategic importance now lay in the east, closer to the trade routes of Asia, the fertile lands of Egypt, and the vulnerable frontiers threatened by Persians and nomadic tribes. Constantine sought a new capital, a city that would embody his power and his vision of a Christian empire. He found it on the site of an old Greek colony, Byzantium. The choice was brilliant. Byzantium sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, commanding the narrow strait of the Bosphorus. Whoever controlled this position controlled the trade routes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, between the East and the West. It was a place where wealth flowed, armies marched, and cultures met. In 324 CE, after defeating his last rival, Licinius, Constantine began transforming Byzantium into his new imperial capital. He spared no expense. Palaces, forums, churches, and grand public buildings rose from the ground. He imported statues, treasures, and works of art from across the empire to adorn his new city. In 330 CE, he officially dedicated it as Constantinople, the city of Constantine. Constantinople was more than a city. It was a statement. It proclaimed that the center of Roman power had shifted. Rome's legacy would continue, but now in a new guise, one that fused Roman tradition with Greek culture and Christian faith. Constantine envisioned his city as a new Rome, yet it soon developed its own distinct identity, with its soaring churches, bustling markets, and strategic walls. Constantinople became the jewel of the empire, a fortress of civilization, standing between East and West. But Constantine's reign was not without contradictions. While he championed Christianity, he continued to use traditional pagan imagery to secure support among the old aristocracy. He built churches, yet also raised monuments honoring the sun god Sol, Invictus. His rule blended pragmatism with faith, politics with piety. He called the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, bringing together bishops from across the Christian world to settle disputes over doctrine, particularly the nature of Christ. This council produced the Nicene Creed, a statement of belief still recited by millions of Christians today. In doing so, Constantine set a precedent. Emperors would play a decisive role in shaping church affairs, intertwining spiritual authority with imperial power. Yet this intertwining carried dangers. By making Christianity the favored religion of the state, Constantine altered the balance of power within the empire. Pagan temples began to lose their status, and old traditions faced decline. Christians, once persecuted, could now persecute others. The faith that had thrived in the margins of society was now entangled with politics, wealth, and imperial ambition. This fusion would both strengthen and trouble the Byzantine world for centuries to come. Constantine ruled until 337 CE. On his deathbed, he received baptism, finally committing fully to the faith that had guided his reign. His body was laid to rest in the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, buried as though he were the 13th apostle himself, a ruler who believed he had been chosen by God to guide a Christian empire. With his death, the empire passed to his sons, and the long, tumultuous history of Byzantium began in earnest. But the seeds Constantine planted were both a blessing and a burden. His city would become the greatest fortress of Christendom, yet also a target for enemies on all sides. His fusion of church and state would create unity, but also sow discord as theological disputes became political crises. And his legacy would cast a long shadow. Emperors for centuries would claim to be the heirs of Constantine, defenders of the faith, and rulers of a holy empire, as Constantinople rose in splendor. So too did the challenges facing the empire. Constantine had laid the foundation, but could his successors preserve it? The empire stood at the dawn of a new age, an age of triumphs and betrayals, of golden mosaics and burning cities, of saints and heretics. The Byzantine Empire had been born, but survival was another matter, for beyond its shining walls, new threats were gathering, threats that would test the empire's strength, its faith, and its very existence. Chapter 3: Justinian and Theodora, the empire's golden dream. By the 6th century, the Byzantine Empire stood as the heir to Rome, yet distinct from it, a place where Greek culture, Roman law, and Christian faith fused into something entirely new. Its streets bustled with merchants from across the world, its churches rang with chants in Greek and Latin, and its emperors ruled with an authority that reached from the Pillars of Hercules to the deserts of Mesopotamia. But amid the grandeur and the turmoil of this empire, one reign would shine above all others, dazzling with both ambition and contradiction. The reign of Justinian I and his formidable empress, Theodora. Together, they dreamed of restoring Rome's lost glory and building a Christian empire to rival eternity itself. Their story is one of brilliance and brutality, vision and vengeance, triumph and tragedy, a chapter in Byzantine history so extraordinary that its echoes still linger in the stones of Istanbul today. Justinian was born around 482 CE in a small village in the province of Dardania, far from the marble colonnades of Constantinople. His origins were humble. His uncle, Justin, rose through the ranks of the imperial guard and eventually seized the throne in 518 CE, when Justin became emperor. He elevated his nephew, who quickly displayed intelligence, discipline, and relentless ambition. Unlike many who rose from obscurity, Justinian was not content to bask in his uncle's reflected glory. He hungered for more. He immersed himself in law, theology, and military affairs, earning a reputation as a scholar as well as a statesman. By the time Justinian was crowned emperor in 527 CE, he was prepared not merely to govern, but to remake the empire itself. If Justinian was the architect of the Byzantine Golden Age, Theodora was its steel. Her early life was anything but imperial. Born the daughter of a bear trainer for the Hippodrome circus, she grew up in the rough and theatrical world of Constantinople's performers. Ancient chroniclers, many hostile to her, claimed she worked as an actress and courtesan in her youth. Whatever the truth, Theodora possessed a sharp mind, indomitable will, and extraordinary charisma. She caught Justinian's eye, and despite opposition from the aristocracy who scorned her low birth, he married her. In 527, the same year Justinian became emperor, Theodora was crowned empress. Together, they were an unlikely pair, the austere, scholarly Justinian and the fiery, pragmatic Theodora. Yet their union proved one of the most dynamic partnerships in history. She was not a mere consort, but a co-ruler, shaping policy, guiding decisions, and saving the throne itself when crisis came. Justinian's vision for his reign was nothing less than the restoration of the Roman Empire's former glory. He sought to reclaim lost western provinces, codify Roman law, and erect monuments that would proclaim the eternal majesty of his rule. His ambitions stretched from Spain to Mesopotamia, from the deserts of Africa to the forests of the Balkans. He believed himself chosen by God to restore Rome, and he pursued this mission with relentless energy. Yet the empire he inherited was beset with challenges. Enemies pressed on its borders, finances strained under heavy taxation, and Constantinople itself simmered with unrest. The first great test came in 532 CE, with the Nika riots, one of the most violent uprisings in the city's history. Constantinople's hippodrome, the massive stadium for chariot races, was not merely a place of sport but a hotbed of political factionalism. Two rival groups, the Blues and the Greens, represented not only sports teams but also social and political loyalties. When discontent over taxation and corruption boiled over, these factions united in rebellion. For 5 days, chaos consumed the city. The rioters set fire to buildings, looted palaces, and even proclaimed a rival emperor. Justinian, faced with the fury of his own people, considered fleeing the city, but Theodora would not allow it. In one of history's most dramatic moments, she delivered a speech that steeled Justinian's resolve. "Those who have worn the crown should never survive its loss," she declared. "I shall never see the day when I am not saluted as empress. If flight were the only means of safety, still I should scorn it. The royal purple is the noblest shroud." Her words electrified the court. Justinian chose to fight. He ordered his generals, Belisarius and Mundus, to trap the rebels in the hippodrome. Their imperial troops slaughtered as many as 30,000 people. The revolt was crushed, the throne secured, but the city lay in ashes. From those ashes rose Justinian's greatest legacy, the rebuilding of Constantinople on a scale more magnificent than ever before. At the heart of this renewal stood the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. Completed in 537, it was unlike anything the world had seen. Its massive dome seemed to float on light, its interior glittered with mosaics of gold and precious stone, and its vast spaces echoed with the solemnity of divine majesty. For nearly 1,000 years, it was the largest church in Christendom, a symbol not only of Justinian's power, but of Byzantium's spiritual mission. When he gazed upon it, Justinian is said to have exclaimed, "Solomon, I have surpassed you, Hagia." Sophia was more than a building, it was a statement of eternal empire. But Justinian's ambitions extended far beyond architecture. He launched a series of military campaigns to reclaim the lost provinces of the West. His brilliant general, Belisarius, led Byzantine armies to stunning victories. In 533, he defeated the Vandals in North Africa, restoring the rich provinces of Carthage to imperial rule. Soon after, he turned to Italy, where the Ostrogoths held sway. Years of brutal war followed, but by 554, much of Italy was back in Byzantine hands. Even parts of Spain were recovered. For a moment, it seemed Justinian had achieved the dream of renovatio, imperator, restoration of empire. The Mediterranean once again shimmered as a Roman lake, its shores linked under Byzantine dominion. Yet these triumphs came at a staggering cost. Wars drained, the treasury armies stretched the empire thin, and newly conquered lands proved difficult to hold. Worse still, in 541, a catastrophe struck that no general could defeat, the plague of Justinian. Carried by rats and fleas from ships arriving from Egypt, the disease swept through Constantinople with terrifying speed. Corpses piled in the streets, families perished in days, and fear gripped the city. Ancient chroniclers claimed 10,000 people died each day at the plague's peak. Across the empire, millions perished. Justinian himself contracted the disease, but survived, though weakened. The empire never fully recovered its population or resources. What had been gained through conquest risked being lost through depopulation and despair. Meanwhile, theological controversies roiled the empire. Christianity, now firmly established, was far from unified. Disputes over the nature of Christ, whether he was of one substance with God the Father, or of two natures, divine and human, sparked fierce debates and even riots. Justinian, determined to impose unity, convened councils, issued decrees, and sought to reconcile factions. Yet his efforts often deepened divisions. In trying to be both emperor and theologian, he blurred the line between church and state, a tension that would haunt Byzantium for centuries. Through it all, Theodora remained a formidable presence. She championed the rights of women, passing laws to protect them from exploitation, expanding divorce rights, and funding convents where former prostitutes could find refuge. She was Justinian's equal in governance, his partner in diplomacy, and his shield against enemies both foreign and domestic. When she died in 548, Justinian was devastated. He never remarried, ruling alone for nearly 2 decades more. But without Theodora, his reign lost some of its fire. By the time of his death, in 565, Justinian had left behind an empire transformed. He had expanded its borders, codified Roman law in the Corpus Juris Civilis, which would shape European legal systems for centuries, and filled Constantinople with architectural wonders. Yet his achievements were fragile. Much of Italy would soon fall to the Lombards. Spain slipped from Byzantine control, and the treasury was nearly bankrupt. The dream of a restored Roman Empire flickered brightly, but briefly. Still, Justinian and Theodora's legacy endured in the shining dome of Hagia Sophia, in the pages of law, and in the memory of a golden age when Byzantium dared to grasp eternity. But even as the empire basked in its grandeur, new storms gathered on the horizon. To the east, a resurgent Persia threatened war. To the north, Slavic tribes pressed into the Balkans. And within, theological disputes festered like open wounds. The glory of Justinian's reign raised the empire to dazzling heights. But could it withstand the shadows closing in? For in the centuries to come, Byzantium would face enemies greater than plague, more enduring than rebellion, and more relentless than ambition. Chapter 4. The Age of Heraclius' War, Faith, and the Rise of a New Enemy. By the early 7th century, the Byzantine Empire stood at a crossroads. The dazzling reign of Justinian had left behind triumphs of architecture, law, and fleeting conquests, but also the weight of overextension, financial strain, and depopulation from plague. His successors proved far less capable. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession. Assassinations shook the palace, and the empire seemed adrift. Borders weakened, provinces rebelled, and Constantinople itself simmered with unrest. Then, in 610 CE, amid the turmoil of rebellion, a new emperor ascended the throne, Heraclius, a man whose reign would be defined by epic struggles of survival and transformation. His story is one of desperate wars, spiritual renewal, and the rise of a force that would forever alter the fate of Byzantium. The armies of Islam. Heraclius was not born to the purple. He hailed from North Africa, the son of the Exarch of Carthage, a powerful provincial governor. When the empire groaned under the misrule of Emperor Phocas, whose brutality and incompetence had alienated allies and emboldened enemies, Heraclius's father launched a rebellion. Heraclius the Younger sailed to Constantinople with the support of the fleet, deposed Phocas, and seized the throne in 610. He inherited not an empire at peace, but one on the brink of ruin. To the east, the Sassanid Persians, Byzantium's ancient rivals, surged across the frontiers, capturing Syria and marching deeper into imperial lands. To the north, Slavic tribes pressed into the Balkans, threatening Greece itself. The treasury lay empty, the army weakened, and morale shattered. Few empires have faced a darker hour. The Persian offensive proved catastrophic. Their brilliant general, Sharbaraz, swept through the Levant, seizing Damascus and Jerusalem. In 614 the Holy City fell, and with it, one of Christendom's greatest relics, the true cross, said to be the very wood upon which Christ was crucified. The Persians carried it off to their capital at Ctesiphon, a humiliation that shook the Christian world to its core. Pilgrims wept, bishops raged, and Constantinople trembled. To lose Jerusalem was a blow, not merely of territory, but of faith. Soon after, the Persians pressed into Egypt, the empire's breadbasket, cutting off its grain supply. By 619, Byzantium had lost its richest provinces, and famine haunted Constantinople. To many, it seemed the empire's end was inevitable. Heraclius, however, refused to surrender. At first, he even considered abandoning Constantinople and relocating the capital to Carthage, where resources were more secure. But the Patriarch of Constantinople, Sergius, persuaded him to stay, arguing that God had not forsaken the city chosen by Constantine himself. Together, Emperor and Patriarch forged a plan of desperate resistance. Heraclius reorganized the empire's finances, melting down church treasures and demanding extraordinary sacrifices from clergy and people alike. Gold chalices, silver crosses, and jeweled icons were taken from the churches to pay for soldiers' wages. Many protested, but Sergius declared it a holy cause, the defense of Christ's empire. Heraclius poured these resources into rebuilding the army, training new troops, and reviving morale. Then, in 622, he launched a bold counteroffensive. What followed was one of the most dramatic military turnarounds in history. Heraclius led his forces personally, a rare act for Byzantine emperors in this age. He marched into Anatolia, struck at Persian armies, and won stunning victories. Year after year, he campaigned tirelessly, wintering in rough camps, fighting in hostile lands, and inspiring his men with speeches that framed the war as nothing less than a holy struggle for survival. In 627, at the Battle of Nineveh, he delivered the decisive blow. His army smashed the Persians, and Heraclius himself is said to have slain the Persian general in single combat. The road to Ctesiphon lay open, though Heraclius could not capture the Persian capital. The defeat sparked a palace coup in Persia, and the new king, Khosrow's son Kavad II, sued for peace. The terms were astonishing. The Persians agreed to withdraw from all conquered territories and return the true cross to the Byzantines. In 630, Heraclius triumphantly entered Jerusalem, carrying the relic himself into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The empire, once at the brink of destruction, seemed saved. Heraclius was hailed as a new Constantine, a savior of Christendom. His victories restored not only territory, but also spiritual pride. Yet beneath the triumph lay exhaustion. Decades of war had drained the empire's resources, depopulated its provinces, and left its armies weary. Fields lay fallow, cities depopulated, and treasuries empty once more. Worse still, religious divisions festered. The empire's eastern provinces, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, were home to large populations of Christians who rejected the imperial doctrine of Chalcedonian Christianity. These so-called Monophysites resented Byzantine attempts to impose theological conformity. Heraclius sought compromise, proposing a doctrine called monothelitism, which held that Christ had two natures, but a single divine will. It was meant to reconcile factions, but instead, it deepened divisions, pleasing no one fully. The unity of the empire remained fragile. Then, from the deserts of Arabia, a new power emerged, swift, fervent, and unstoppable. The followers of Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, had united the tribes of Arabia under a new faith and a burning zeal. In 632, Muhammad died, but his successors, the caliphs, launched a series of conquests that would shock the world. By 634, Arab armies crossed into Byzantine Syria. At first Heraclius dismissed them as raiders, no more dangerous than the nomads who had harassed the empire's frontiers for centuries. But these warriors were different, disciplined, united, and driven by religious conviction. They fought with extraordinary speed, striking across deserts, where Byzantine armies struggled to maneuver. In 636, at the Battle of Yarmouk, the Byzantines suffered a crushing defeat. Entire legions were annihilated, commanders slain, and Syria lost forever. The Arabs swept into Palestine, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, seizing provinces Justinian had once reclaimed with such cost. By 642, Egypt itself, the empire's breadbasket, was in Muslim hands. What Persia had taken and lost, Islam now claimed permanently. For Heraclius, the devastation was unbearable. Old, sick, and broken, he withdrew from public life, dying in 641, a defeated man. The savior of Byzantium had lived long enough to see its greatest losses, yet his reign had reshaped the empire in profound ways. Though vast territories were gone, the core of the empire, Anatolia, the Balkans, and Constantinople itself, remained intact. More importantly, Heraclius initiated a system of defense that would allow Byzantium to endure. He reorganized the empire into themes, military districts governed by generals who could quickly mobilize local troops. This system, born of necessity, would become the backbone of Byzantine resilience for centuries. And though the loss of the true cross had once been a wound, its recovery during Heraclius's reign gave Constantinople a renewed sense of divine favor. However short-lived, the age of Heraclius was thus a paradox. Dazzling victory followed by catastrophic defeat. Spiritual renewal, shadowed by crushing loss. Byzantium had survived Persia, only to be struck by a far greater force. The Arabs were not like other enemies. They did not raid and retreat. They conquered and settled, building a new empire of their own. Byzantium, once the master of the Mediterranean, now found itself clinging to survival against a faith-driven civilization rising at its doorstep. The stage was set for centuries of conflict, a struggle between crescent and cross that would define the medieval world. As the 7th century drew to a close, Constantinople itself became the prize. Twice, in 674 and again in 717. Massive Arab fleets and armies would lay siege to the Queen of Cities, determined to seize the heart of Byzantium. The survival of the empire would hang by a thread, its fate decided by fire, faith, and sheer endurance. The question was no longer whether Byzantium could reclaim its former glory, but whether it could endure at all. Chapter 5. Fire over the Bosporus. The Arab sieges of Constantinople. The death of Emperor Heraclius, in 641, left the Byzantine Empire exhausted, battered, and deeply uncertain about its future. His victories against Persia had once seemed to restore the empire's destiny, but the sudden rise of Islam had reversed every gain. Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, lands rich in history, wealth, and faith, were now gone. To the west, Slavic tribes pressed into the Balkans. To the east, Arab cavalry swept across the deserts, expanding their new empire at dizzying speed. Byzantium, once the unrivaled master of the Mediterranean, now seemed reduced to a fortress clinging desperately to Anatolia and the capital itself, Constantinople, the queen of cities. It was into this storm that a new age of warfare and innovation began. For the survival of Constantinople would depend not only on the strength of its walls, but on a terrifying invention that became legend. Greek fire. The Arab onslaught the 7th century was a whirlwind of Islamic expansion. Within a single generation after Muhammad's death, the armies of the Rashidun caliphs swept from Arabia into the Fertile Crescent, Persia, and Egypt. Victories came in rapid succession. Yarmouk, in 636, crushed the Byzantine army in Syria. The fall of Alexandria in 642 ended Byzantine Egypt. The Muslims proved more than conquerors. They were administrators who consolidated rule and spread their faith. The empire reeled. Constantinople's emperors in this era were weak, often murdered or deposed by palace coups. Heraclius's heirs squabbled over power, leaving Byzantium vulnerable to enemies. The Arabs pressed their advantage, launching raids deep into Anatolia. By the mid-7th century, they reached the very coasts of Asia Minor, threatening the Bosporus itself. The once distant deserts of Arabia now cast shadows on the walls of Constantinople. But the Arabs were not content with raiding. They sought nothing less than the jewel of the Byzantine crown, the capital itself. To conquer Constantinople was to strike at the heart of Christendom and cement the supremacy of Islam. Thus began one of the most dramatic contests of survival in history, the Arab sieges of Constantinople. The first siege, 674 to 678. The first great attempt came under the Umayyad Caliph Muawiyah, the first in 674. The Arab fleet sailed into the Sea of Marmara, anchoring near Constantinople. For 4 years, the Arabs waged a campaign of attrition, striking the city during the summer and retreating during the winter. Each year, they returned, testing the defenses, probing for weakness. The Theodosian walls, the city's legendary fortifications built in the 5th century, stood tall and unbroken. Triple layers of stone, moats, and towers made them virtually impregnable. But the Byzantines had more than walls. They had a new and terrifying weapon, one that changed the nature of naval warfare. Greek fire. Its exact composition remains one of history's great mysteries, perhaps a mixture of petroleum, quicklime, sulfur, and resin. What made it fearsome was not only its intensity, but its behavior. Greek fire ignited on contact with water. Flames clung to ships, men, and sea alike, unquenchable by buckets or sand. Victims leaped into the sea, only to find the inferno followed them. When the Arab fleet closed in, Byzantine ships equipped with siphons unleashed torrents of Greek fire. Chronicles describe the sea itself, blazing as enemy ships were engulfed. Panic spread among the Arabs. Their formations shattered, and their vessels burned to the waterline. The weapons seemed almost supernatural, a gift from God to defend the Christian empire. For 4 years, the Byzantines repelled wave after wave of assault, until finally, in 678, the Arabs withdrew in defeat. Constantinople had survived. The victory was celebrated as divine deliverance. The patriarch proclaimed that the Virgin Mary herself had shielded the city. Hymns of thanksgiving echoed through Hagia Sophia, and the Byzantines believed their capital was protected by heaven. Yet beneath the jubilation lay a sobering truth. The Arab threat had not ended, only delayed. The Muslim caliphate was vast, rich, and determined. The siege had been a prelude, not the finale. The caliphate expands in the decades that followed. The Arabs continued their relentless expansion. They swept across North Africa, seizing Carthage in 698, erasing the very province that had once launched Heraclius's rebellion. From there, they crossed into Spain in 711, conquering the Visigothic kingdom and pressing into the heart of Europe. By 732, they reached France, only halted at the Battle of Tours by Charles Martel. To Byzantium. These conquests were alarming, for they revealed the boundless ambition of the caliphate. Constantinople remained the ultimate prize. Its conquest would symbolize Islam's triumph over Christianity, the unseating of Rome's last heir. The empire braced itself for another confrontation, this time on an even greater scale. The second siege, 717 to 718, by the early 8th century. The Umayyad Caliphate had grown stronger than ever. In 717, Caliph Suleiman launched a massive expedition to capture Constantinople once and for all. His brother Maslama commanded an army said to number over 100,000, with a fleet of 1,800 ships. The scale was staggering, dwarfing any previous assault. The Byzantines under Emperor Leo III faced annihilation. In August 717, the Arab forces crossed the Bosporus and encircled Constantinople. The siege began. Supplies dwindled, hunger gripped the city, and disease spread. The people prayed, fasted, and endured, their eyes fixed on the horizon for salvation. Once again, Greek fire proved decisive. Byzantine ships struck the Arab fleet with waves of liquid flame, devastating their lines. But even as ships burned, the land army remained, tightening the noose around the city. Winter fell, one of the harshest in memory. Snow blanketed the Arab camp, and supplies ran short. Horses starved, men froze, and disease decimated their ranks. Meanwhile, Byzantine defenders held out grimly behind their walls, bolstered by the knowledge that survival meant the salvation of their empire then. In 718, fortune turned decisively. The Bulgars, northern neighbors of Byzantium, launched a surprise attack on the Arab forces, slaughtering thousands. At sea, Byzantine fire ships continued to harry the invaders. Finally, after a year of devastation, the Arab army retreated. Survivors staggered home, leaving behind mountains of corpses and shattered dreams. The failure was catastrophic for the caliphate. Tens of thousands had perished. The dream of capturing Constantinople, though attempted again in centuries to come, had been broken for now. For the Byzantines it was more than a victory. It was survival against impossible odds. The empire endured, battered but unbroken. And the legend of Constantinople as an unconquerable city deepened. The rise of the Isaurians. Leo III, the emperor who had steered Byzantium through the second siege, emerged as a strong and capable ruler. He reorganized the empire, strengthened the army, and secured the borders. But he also ushered in one of the most controversial and divisive policies in Byzantine history: iconoclasm, the rejection and destruction of religious images. Leo believed that icons, the sacred paintings venerated by the faithful, had become idolatrous and provoked God's wrath. In 726, he issued an edict banning their worship. Across the empire, soldiers stripped churches of mosaics, smashed holy images, and painted over frescoes. Monks and laypeople resisted fiercely, defending the icons they believed were windows to the divine. Civil strife followed, tearing at the fabric of the empire just as external enemies loomed. Yet Leo's reign stabilized the empire. The Arab threat remained, but the great sieges had been repelled. Constantinople stood as a beacon of endurance, defying the tide of conquest that had swept away empires around it. A city of endurance, the Arab sieges of Constantinople were more than military contests. They were struggles of faith, identity, and survival. For the Byzantines, victory meant more than territory. It was proof of divine favor. For the Arabs, defeat marked a limit to expansion, a frontier they could not yet breach. The Theodosian walls and Greek fire had saved the empire, but so too had the resilience of its people, who endured famine, cold, and despair behind their great defenses. Yet, beneath the triumph, Byzantium remained fragile. Provinces were gone, enemies circled, and internal divisions, like the brewing conflict over icons, threatened stability. The empire had survived the storm, but new tempests gathered. The Bulgars pressed in the Balkans. Arabs continued raids in Anatolia, and within the palace, intrigue never ceased. The city endured, yes, but how long could it withstand the weight of history pressing against its gates? The answer lay not in peace, but in yet more centuries of fire, faith, and betrayal. For beyond the walls, new enemies stirred, rising powers that would not simply raid or retreat, but challenge Byzantium in ways even Greek fire could not extinguish. Chapter 6: The War of Images, Iconoclasm, and the fracturing of faith. The great Arab sieges had been endured, and the Byzantine Empire survived. The Theodosian walls had not fallen, Greek fire had blazed across the seas, and the people of Constantinople had clung to life through famine and frost. Yet, even as the city raised its banners in triumph, a new storm gathered not from without, but from within, for the empire that had withstood the armies of the caliphate would soon be torn apart by a different kind of war, not over land or treasure, but over the very soul of its faith. This was the era of iconoclasm, a conflict as fierce and consuming as any siege, where brother rose against brother, monks defied emperors, and sacred images became battlegrounds of loyalty and belief. The emperor's challenge to heaven in 726, Emperor Leo III, the Isaurian, who had led Byzantium through the Second Arab Siege, issued an edict that stunned Christendom. The veneration of icons was forbidden. For centuries, Byzantine churches had been adorned with images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints. These icons were not mere decorations. They were seen as windows to the divine, channels through which heaven touched earth. The faithful kissed them, lit lamps before them, carried them in procession, and prayed to them in times of need. But Leo saw something else. To him, the empire's calamities, the loss of provinces, the plagues, the endless invasions, were signs of God's anger. He believed that the people had strayed into idolatry, worshipping painted wood and gilded mosaics rather than God himself. In his eyes, it was not Islam or the Arabs that had brought disaster, but the corruption of Christian practice. His edict, ordering the removal of icons, was meant to purify the faith and save the empire. The consequences were explosive. Across Constantinople and beyond, soldiers stormed into churches, tearing icons from walls, smashing mosaics, and burning sacred paintings. Priests who resisted were beaten or exiled. Monks who defended their icons were branded as heretics. The great dome of Hagia Sophia itself was stripped of its Christ Pantocrator image. The faithful wept as their sacred art was destroyed, seeing in the emperor's decree not reform but blasphemy. A war without borders. Iconoclasm did not remain a private theological dispute. It became a political earthquake that shook the entire Christian world. Monks, the spiritual backbone of Byzantine society, were the fiercest defenders of icons. They argued that Christ had taken human form. Therefore, his image could be depicted and venerated without idolatry. To destroy icons, they claimed, was to deny the incarnation itself. The struggle spread across the empire like wildfire. In the provinces, villagers rose up against imperial officials sent to enforce the bans. Monasteries became fortresses of resistance, where icons were hidden and venerated in secret. Families risked persecution to keep small painted panels in their homes, lighting candles before them in defiance of imperial law. The conflict even reached beyond Byzantium's borders. The Pope in Rome, horrified by Leo's edict, condemned the emperor's actions and defended the use of icons. This widened the growing rift between the Byzantine East and the Latin West, straining bonds that had once united Christendom. Where once Rome and Constantinople stood together against heresy, now they glared across the sea as rivals. The empire had resisted the Arab armies through unity and faith. Now that unity was dissolving, as soldiers and citizens alike debated whether the emperor was God's chosen defender or a tyrant, leading them into heresy. The sword and the brush. Iconoclasm transformed art and culture. With images forbidden, Byzantine churches turned away from human figures and toward austere decoration, geometric patterns, crosses, and stark walls stripped of saints' faces. Where once the gaze of Christ or Mary met worshippers in shimmering mosaics, now bare plaster confronted them. The empire's artistic brilliance, which had dazzled the world since Justinian's day, was dimmed. But resistance inspired new creativity. Secret workshops flourished, painting icons in hidden monasteries or remote caves, These clandestine images, carried from hand to hand, became symbols of defiance. To possess one was dangerous. To protect one was an act of devotion. Stories spread of icons that wept, bled, or performed miracles in secret, signs that heaven itself rejected the emperor's decree. This underground culture of resistance strengthened the mystique of icons, making them more powerful than ever in the hearts of believers. The struggle was not only over theology, but over the identity of Byzantium itself. Was the empire a realm where the emperor's word could reshape faith? Or was it a realm where the people's devotion to sacred tradition stood higher than imperial command? The heirs of Leo III ruled until 741, enforcing his policies with an iron hand. When he died, his son, Constantine V, inherited both the throne and the iconoclast cause. Constantine was brilliant, ruthless, and relentless. He summoned councils that declared icons heretical, branding their defenders as idol worshippers. Monks were tortured, their monasteries dissolved, their lands seized to fund the army. Yet Constantine also proved a formidable general. He campaigned successfully against the Bulgars, securing victories that stabilized the northern frontier. His reign became a paradox, militarily strong, religiously divisive. To his soldiers, he was a hero who crushed enemies. To the faithful, who clung to icons, he was Copanemus the Defiler, cursed in whispers as a heretic emperor. His persecution of monks was particularly brutal. Chroniclers speak of monks paraded through the streets, mocked, and forced into humiliating marriages. Others were blinded, exiled, or killed. Monasteries once filled with chants of prayer fell silent, their treasures looted. For Constantine, the war on icons was not only theological, but political. By breaking the power of the monasteries, he weakened a rival center of authority and enriched the state. But repression could not extinguish devotion. Iconophile martyrs became legends, their suffering inspiring generations to resist. Secret icons circulated as holy relics, their survival a quiet rebuke to imperial power. The empire at war with itself, the iconoclast controversy dragged on for decades, shaping emperors and defining reigns. Civil unrest simmered constantly. Rebellions broke out, sometimes with icons as their rallying banners. Entire provinces wavered in loyalty, uncertain whether their faith aligned with their emperor. The unity that had once made Byzantium resilient against external enemies was splintered, and the enemies never stopped pressing. The Arabs continued their raids into Anatolia. The Bulgars, emboldened in the north, struck deeper into the Balkans. The empire was battered on every side, yet its fiercest battles were waged not on fields of blood, but in chapels and monasteries, in whispered prayers before forbidden images, in debates that pitted soldier against monk, emperor against patriarch, family against family. It was a war without end, a wound that never fully closed. The triumph of the icons at last. After more than a century of conflict, the tide began to turn. In 787, under Empress Irene, a council was summoned at Nicaea, which restored the veneration of icons. Monks emerged from exile, churches were redecorated, mosaics restored. The faithful rejoiced, believing the empire had been reconciled with God. But Irene's triumph was fleeting. Later emperors revived iconoclasm, and the struggle dragged on until 823, when Empress Theodora finally ended it with the solemn restoration of icons in the churches of Constantinople. The event was celebrated as the triumph of orthodoxy, marked each year thereafter in Byzantine liturgy. The empire was scarred but not broken. Icons once again adorned Hagia Sophia, their golden faces shining above the faithful. Monks resumed their chants, pilgrims their devotions. The war was over, but its legacy endured. The memory of persecution, martyrdom, and division haunted Byzantium, leaving deep fissures in its soul. A fractured empire iconoclasm had saved no provinces, conquered no enemies, secured no borders. Instead, it had weakened the empire internally, estranged it from Rome, and fostered distrust between rulers and people. Yet it also left Byzantium changed, its art transformed, its theology clarified, its sense of identity sharpened. The Byzantines emerged as a people who had fought not only with swords and fire but with brushstrokes and prayers, proving that the greatest battles were often invisible to the world outside. But the world outside had not forgotten Byzantium. To the west, the rising power of the Franks under Charlemagne began to overshadow Rome itself. To the east, the Abbasid Caliphate inherited the mantle of Islamic expansion. And to the north, beyond the steppes and forests, new peoples stirred, pagans and warriors whose ships would soon carve paths into the rivers of Europe and the Black Sea. The empire had survived its war with itself, but new storms gathered. The Byzantines, weary from theological strife, were unprepared for the next wave of danger, a danger that would come not with icons or councils, but with long ships cutting through the waters, carrying raiders whose fury would ignite new nightmares. For on the horizon, sails were rising, the sails of the Rus and the Vikings. Chapter 7. From the north, the coming of the Rus. The fires of iconoclasm had burned through the empire for more than a century, but by the mid-9th century Byzantium emerged, scarred yet still standing. Icons had been restored, monasteries reopened, and the chants of the faithful once again filled the marble halls of Hagia Sophia. The empire had survived the Arab sieges, the Bulgar wars, and even its own self-inflicted wounds. But the Byzantines were weary, their strength drained by internal divisions and endless wars. It was at this moment of fragile recovery that a new power appeared, not from the deserts of Arabia or the plains of Bulgaria, but from the frozen rivers and forests of the far north. They were called the Rus, and their arrival would change Byzantium forever. The northern strangers for generations. Byzantine merchants had heard rumors of strange traders from the north, men who sailed long ships down the great rivers of Eastern Europe. They brought furs, wax, honey, and slaves, exchanging them for silk, wine, and silver. These men were tall, fair-haired, and fierce, their speech foreign, and their customs wild. To some, they were Varangians, Norsemen from across the Baltic Sea, kin to the Vikings who had ravaged the coasts of the west. To others, they were Slavs who had taken on Norse ways. Whatever their origins, the Byzantines called them Rus. At first, they came as traders. They rowed their long ships down the Dnieper River, through dense forests and treacherous rapids, until they reached the Black Sea. From there, they sailed southward, their prows cutting through the dark waves toward Constantinople. The markets of the Queen of Cities dazzled them, and they carried home stories of its riches, golden mosaics, marble palaces, and streets filled with treasures beyond imagining. But two men who lived by the sword. Wealth was not something to admire, it was something to take. The first assault in the summer of 860, Constantinople awoke to terror. The sea walls that had long withstood Arab fleets now faced a new armada, hundreds of Rus longships, their dragon-headed prows gleaming in the sun, their sails billowing with northern winds. The Byzantines were unprepared. Emperor Michael III was campaigning far from the capital, and much of the navy was away. The Rus descended like wolves. They raided the suburbs of Constantinople, burning villages, slaughtering peasants, and looting monasteries. The terrified citizens fled behind the great Theodosian walls, watching as the foreigners pillaged the land before their eyes. The invaders could not breach the walls, few could, but they ravaged everything outside. It was a nightmare the Byzantines had not expected. The Arabs they knew, the Bulgars they feared, but these northerners were something else, strangers with no respect for treaties, no reverence for Rome or Christ, no hesitation in desecrating holy sites. Chronicles speak of churches burned, icons smashed, and priests cut down at the altar. The smoke of burning villages rose against the sky as the Rus prowled the waters, daring the empire to respond, and then as suddenly as they came, they were gone. Laden with plunder, they sailed back north, vanishing into the rivers from which they had emerged. The empire, shaken and humiliated, realized that it had met a new enemy, one who could strike from the sea like the Arabs, but whose origins lay in the dark unknown of the northern world. Shadows from the forest, the Rus were more than raiders. Over time, they carved out realms in the lands of the Slavs, founding settlements that would grow into the first Russian and Ukrainian cities. Kiev, Novgorod, and Smolensk rose under their control, ruled by Norse chieftains who blended with Slavic traditions. From these bases, they could strike south toward Byzantium or east toward the steppes top to the Byzantines. The Rus were both threat and opportunity. Their raids were devastating, but their trade was profitable. Every year, ships laden with furs and slaves sailed to Constantinople, escorted by Byzantine officials to prevent another surprise attack. Treaties were signed, broken, and signed again, as the empire sought to tame the northern wolves with diplomacy while preparing for the next storm. The Byzantines also recognized something more. The Rus were a people in search of identity. They were fierce warriors, but their societies lacked the deep religious and cultural roots of Byzantium. Some emperors saw in them not only enemies to be feared but souls to be converted. If the Rus could be brought into the orbit of Christianity, perhaps they could become allies rather than predators. Diplomacy and the sword throughout the 9th and 10th centuries. The relationship between Byzantium and the Rus swung like a pendulum between war and alliance. Rus princes launched new raids on Constantinople, sometimes reaching the gates of the city, sometimes forcing treaties that gave them favorable trading rights. At other times, Rus warriors were recruited into Byzantine service as mercenaries. Their ferocity turned against Arab or Bulgar enemies. It was in this period that the famed Varangian Guard was born, an elite corps of Norse warriors who swore loyalty not to the empire, but to the emperor himself. Their axes and shields became the bodyguard of Byzantine rulers, a force feared for its discipline and brutality. Ironically, the same people who had once terrorized Constantinople now stood watch over its throne. But peace was always fragile. Beneath the treaties and ceremonies lay a constant tension. The Byzantines viewed the Rus as barbarians, dangerous but useful, while the Rus saw Constantinople as both trading partner and tempting prize. The conversion of the Rus. The true turning point came in the late 10th century with Prince Vladimir of Kiev, ruler of a powerful Rus realm. Vladimir sought both legitimacy and strength. He knew that, to stand among the great powers of the world, his people needed a unifying faith. Paganism bound them loosely, but Christianity offered something greater: the culture, prestige, and alliances of the Christian world. Vladimir sent envoys to study the religions of his neighbors. They visited Muslim lands, but Vladimir rejected Islam for its prohibitions on alcohol. Drinking is the joy of the Rus, he is said to have remarked. They examined Judaism but dismissed it, saying that a people exiled from their homeland could not be strong. They studied Western Christianity in Germany, but it was in Constantinople that they found what they sought. The envoys attended the liturgy in Hagia Sophia, and when they returned, they told Vladimir, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. For on earth there is no such beauty, and we cannot describe it. We only know that God dwells there among men." In 988, Vladimir was baptized, and the Rus began their conversion to Christianity. It was a momentous event. The wild raiders of the north were transformed into Christians, tied by faith to Constantinople. Churches rose in Kiev, icons were painted, and the liturgy of Byzantium echoed in Slavic tongues. The empire had not defeated the Rus with fire or sword, but with faith and beauty. The wolf becomes the hound. Conversion of the Rus changed the balance of power. Byzantium gained a powerful ally in the north, one whose princes intermarried with imperial families and whose soldiers filled the Varangian Guard. The Rus brought manpower, trade, and loyalty, and in return, they received prestige, religion, and culture. Yet, even this alliance was uneasy. The Rus remained proud and independent, and their warriors were always ready to turn against Byzantium if insulted or neglected. The memory of their raids lingered in the minds of Constantinople's citizens, who never fully trusted the barbarians at their gates. Still, for a time, the empire had found in them both shield and sword. The very men who had once burned its villages now defended its emperors, their axes glinting in the torchlight of the imperial palace. A new dawn or a false one. By the dawn of the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire seemed poised for revival. The wounds of iconoclasm were healing, the Arabs were in decline, the Bulgars were under pressure, and the Rus had become partners in faith. The mosaics of Constantinople gleamed once more, and the city's markets were filled with goods from every corner of the known world. But history was never kind to Byzantium for long. As the empire reached for renewal, new dangers gathered at its borders: Norman adventurers in the west, Piceno graders from the steppes, and most ominously, a rising power in the east, the Seljuk Turks, who brought with them not only the sword but a zeal to carve out new empires in the name of Islam. The Byzantines had converted wolves into hounds, but now a new predator stalked the horizon, one sharper, faster, and far more dangerous than any before. And when the Turks struck, they would not raid the suburbs of Constantinople. They would come for the heart of Byzantium itself. Chapter 8. The Rise of Justinian and Theodora. The dawn of the 6th century marked one of the most transformative eras in Byzantine history, defined by ambition, brilliance, and ruthless determination. At its center stood two figures, whose names would forever be etched in both reverence and infamy. Emperor Justinian I and his formidable empress, Theodora. Their reign was a paradox of triumph and tragedy, glory and destruction, leaving behind a legacy that defined the empire's identity for centuries. Justinian, crowned emperor in 527 CE, was no ordinary ruler. Unlike many before him, he possessed a clear vision to restore the Roman Empire to its former greatness. His eyes were not only fixed on the defense of Constantinople, but also on reclaiming the lost provinces of the West. From the moment he ascended the throne, Justinian pursued his dream with relentless energy, shaping policies, commissioning armies, and envisioning grand monuments that would showcase his power to the world. At his side stood Theodora, a woman of unparalleled influence. Born into obscurity, the daughter of a bear-keeper at the Hippodrome, she had once lived a life far removed from the splendor of the imperial court. Yet her intelligence, resilience, and charisma propelled her to the highest seat of power. To many, she was an enigma, admired by some as a champion of the oppressed, despised by others as a manipulative schemer. Together, Justinian and Theodora formed a partnership that would reshape Byzantium's, sometimes through brilliance, sometimes through bloodshed. Their reign was marked first by crisis. In 532 CE, Constantinople erupted in chaos during the infamous Nika riots. What began as chariot-racing rivalries in the Hippodrome escalated into a citywide rebellion. 4 days, the capital burned, and the imperial throne teetered on the brink of collapse. Advisors urged Justinian to flee, but it was Theodora who steeled his resolve. In a speech that still echoes through history, she declared, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud." Her words shamed Justinian into action, and with ruthless decisiveness, he unleashed his generals Belisarius and Mundus upon the rioters. The Hippodrome became a slaughterhouse, with tens of thousands butchered. The city lay in ashes, but Justinian remained on the throne. Hardened and unyielding from the ruins, Justinian sought to immortalize his reign in stone. He commissioned the construction of the Hagia Sophia, a cathedral unlike any the world had ever seen. rising with colossal domes and dazzling mosaics. The Hagia Sophia became the jewel of Constantinople and the greatest monument of Byzantine architecture. To the citizens, it was a symbol of God's glory and Justinian's audacity. Upon its completion, he is said to have proclaimed, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." Yet Justinian's ambitions stretched far beyond the city walls. Through his brilliant general Belisarius, he launched campaigns to reclaim lost Roman territories. North Africa fell from the Vandals, Italy was wrested from the Ostrogoths, and parts of Spain briefly returned under imperial control. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the dream of a restored Roman Empire might come true. But conquest came at a heavy price. Endless wars drained the treasury, and Constantinople was ravaged by the plague of Justinian, a catastrophe that killed nearly half the city's population and spread across the empire like a shadow of death. Grain rotted in the harbors, bodies piled in the streets, and silence haunted neighborhoods once teeming with life. The dream of renewal seemed to crumble under the weight of devastation. Despite such setbacks, Justinian pressed forward with another vision: legal reform. His greatest intellectual legacy, the Corpus Juris Civilis body of civil law, became the foundation of European legal tradition for centuries to come. By codifying centuries of Roman laws, decrees, and rulings, he ensured that the empire's order would endure beyond his reign. It was an achievement as mighty as his wars, though less dramatic than his conquests. Theodora, meanwhile, carved her own legacy. She championed the rights of women, ensuring they could own property, resist forced prostitution, and enjoy protections within marriage. She was feared by the court, but also respected as an empress who ruled with an iron will, equal to her husband's. Together, they embodied the contradictions of Byzantium: splendor and brutality, piety and ruthlessness, triumph and disaster. Their reign was a golden age, built upon blood and fire. And though their achievements seemed eternal, beneath the glittering facade cracks were already forming. For empires, glory is never free. Behind the majesty of Justinian and Theodora's rule lurked forces of decay: the plague, financial exhaustion, and the endless strain of defending fragile borders. And, as history would reveal, the Byzantine Empire's greatest enemies were not always barbarians at the gates, but the weaknesses festering within. Would you like me to continue straight into Chapter 9, Belisarius and the Eternal Wars, in the same polished narrative style? Chapter 9, Belisarius and the Eternal Wars. If Justinian was the architect of empire, then Belisarius was its sword. His name became synonymous with brilliance on the battlefield, a commander who fought not only with cunning strategy, but with loyalty that bordered on tragic. To the Byzantines, he was a living legend. To their enemies, a phantom of terror who struck with precision and vanished just as swiftly. Born in Thrace around 500 CE, Belisarius rose from obscurity to become Justinian's most trusted general. His tall stature, piercing eyes, and calm demeanor masked a mind of extraordinary discipline. He was a soldier who could hold a collapsing line with a handful of men, outmaneuver armies several times larger than his own, and win loyalty from troops who adored him. Yet, like many great warriors, his victories often bred suspicion rather than gratitude in the halls of power. The first stage of his campaigns brought him to North Africa, where the Vandal kingdom had long ruled over Roman lands. The Vandals, though fierce in their heyday, had grown complacent. In 533 CE, with a force of scarcely 15,000 men, Belisarius sailed across the Mediterranean. His army landed at Caput Vada and marched toward Carthage. At the Battle of Ad Decimum, vastly outnumbered, Belisarius shattered the Vandals through tactical brilliance. Within months, North Africa was back in Byzantine hands. The Mediterranean, once fractured, began to whisper again of Roman unity. But Justinian's ambitions did not end there. He cast his gaze upon Italy, homeland of the Caesars. The Ostrogoths held the peninsula, ruling from Ravenna, and Justinian ordered Belisarius to reclaim it. What followed was a brutal, drawn-out conflict known as the Gothic War. For nearly 2 decades, Italy became a graveyard of empires, its cities reduced to ruins, its people starved by endless sieges. Belisarius, leading small armies against overwhelming odds, displayed feats of military genius that seemed almost superhuman. At the Siege of Rome, 537 to 538, he defended the city against an Ostrogothic army 10 times the size of his own, with cunning use of fortifications, ambushes, and psychological warfare. He held the Eternal City, turning back wave after wave of assault. Yet, while Belisarius bled for the empire, Justinian's court whispered against him. Jealous rivals accused him of seeking a crown of his own. His victories were met, not with rewards, but with suspicion. The Italian wars dragged on, draining the empire's treasury and breaking its spirit. When at last, Ravenna fell, and Italy was under Byzantine control, it was a hollow triumph. The peninsula was ravaged, depopulated, and its glory reduced to dust. Belisarius himself, weary and diminished, was recalled to Constantinople, where he found himself not hailed as a savior, but left in uneasy obscurity. Yet the wars were far from over. The eastern frontier demanded attention, for the Sassanid Persians, Byzantium's eternal rivals, pressed hard against the borders. Once again Belisarius was summoned, at the Battle of Dara. He had already proven his genius by turning a vulnerable position into a masterpiece of tactical engineering. Now, he faced them again, maneuvering armies with precision and holding the empire's fragile defenses against collapse. But even the greatest generals could not conquer time. The endless strain of wars Africa, Italy, Persia crippled the empire financially and spiritually, and Belisarius himself, once the shining hope of Byzantium, ended his days in a haze of controversy. Legend claims he was accused of treason, stripped of wealth and power, and forced to beg for alms on the streets of Constantinople, crying, "Give a coin to Belisarius," whom empire once obeyed. Historians debate the truth of this tale, but whether fact or myth, it captures the cruel irony of his life. The man who gave everything to the empire was rewarded with suspicion and disgrace. The eternal wars had brought fleeting glory, but lasting scars. The empire stretched further than it had in centuries, yet its strength was hollowed by plague, famine, and financial ruin. Justinian's dream of a restored Roman Empire had nearly come true, but it came at the cost of weakening Byzantium itself, and as the century turned, darker storms gathered on the horizon. The empire had fought Vandals, Goths, and Persians, but an even greater tide was rising in the deserts of Arabia, tide that would transform the world forever. Chapter 10: The Shadow of the Crescent Moon. The Byzantine Empire, though bloodied from Justinian's wars, still stood as the torchbearer of Roman glory. Its domes glittered, its armies marched, and its emperors dreamed of eternity. Yet, far to the south, beyond the deserts of Arabia, a storm was brewing, a storm that would shatter kingdoms, topple empires, and reshape the very world. It began not with armies, but with a man. In the early 7th century, Muhammad of Mecca preached a message that stirred the tribes of Arabia. One God, one faith, one people united under the banner of Islam. What began as whispers in the sands soon roared like a desert wind. Fragmented tribes that had feuded for centuries now rallied together with newfound zeal. And with unity came power. When Muhammad died in 632 CE, the Arabian tribes did not fracture. Instead, under the leadership of the caliphs, they turned their eyes outward. First, the Arabian Peninsula fell under their command, then Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, all territories long held by Byzantium. Weary from their endless wars with Persia, were unprepared for the ferocity of this new enemy. The first clash came at the Battle of Yarmouk in 636 CE, one of the most catastrophic defeats in Byzantine history. The imperial army, led by Emperor Heraclius's generals, faced an Islamic force commanded by Khalid ibn al-Walid, the Sword of God. The battle raged for 6 days on the windswept plains near the Yarmouk River. At first, the Byzantines outnumbered their foes. Their cavalry thundered across the field, their banners blazed, and their archers darkened the sky with arrows. But discipline crumbled under the relentless fury of the Arabs. Wave after wave, struck with a fire the Byzantines could not match. Whole divisions panicked, fleeing across the cliffs into the river below. When the dust cleared, tens of thousands lay dead, and Syria was lost forever. Heraclius, the once victorious emperor who had humbled Persia, was broken. From the walls of Antioch, he is said to have watched his shattered armies retreat and whispered, "Farewell, Syria. Peace be with you, O fair province. And what a beautiful land you are for your enemy." The fall of Syria was only the beginning. Egypt, the empire's breadbasket, soon followed. City after city fell. Damascus, Jerusalem, Alexandria, each surrendering to the rising crescent. The Byzantines fought desperately, but their empire was stretched thin, their coffers empty, their people exhausted by war and plague. The Islamic armies brought not only conquest, but a sense of divine mission. To the Byzantines, it was a nightmare beyond imagining, an enemy not driven by gold or glory but by faith. Every defeat seemed not just a loss of land, but a spiritual humiliation. The empire that once claimed to be God's chosen was now watching God's favor shift elsewhere. And yet, Byzantium did not die. Though crippled, it adapted. Constantinople, with its impregnable walls and vast defenses, became the shield of Christendom, standing against wave after wave of Arab assaults. Twice the city itself would be besieged by massive Islamic fleets, and twice it would endure, saved by courage and by a terrible weapon of fire that the world had never seen before. But that story was still to come. For now, the empire stood at the edge of annihilation. Its golden age shattered, its land swallowed by the shadow of the crescent moon. And as the caliphs grew stronger, the Byzantines asked themselves a terrifying question: could the Empire of Rome truly survive against a force that believed God himself marched with them? Chapter 11. The Fire That Burned the Sea. The loss of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt had crippled the Byzantine Empire. The great provinces that once fed Constantinople and filled its treasuries were gone, seized by the swift and relentless armies of Islam. The Byzantines were cornered, their empire reduced to a fraction of its former size. Yet their spirit, like the walls of their capital, remained unbroken. And those walls, colossal and legendary, would soon be tested by an enemy unlike any they had ever faced. In the year 674 CE, the Arab Caliphate turned its gaze toward the very heart of Byzantium, Constantinople. The city was more than a capital. It was the jewel of Christendom. The new Rome, a fortress city whose triple walls and mighty towers were said to be impregnable. Whoever held Constantinople did not simply hold a city, they commanded the gateway between East and West. The Arabs, flush with victory after their conquests in the Levant and North Africa, gathered a vast fleet and army. Their plan was bold: to crush the Byzantine Empire once and for all by seizing its beating heart. Waves of Arab ships sailed into the Sea of Marmara, and siege engines thundered against the mighty land walls of Theodosius. From 674 to 678, Constantinople endured wave after wave of attack, its people clinging to their faith and their emperor. It was during these desperate days that the Byzantines unleashed a weapon that seemed more the work of sorcery than science: Greek fire. Its exact composition remains one of history's great mysteries, guarded so closely that even today scholars cannot say with certainty what it contained. Some claim it was a mixture of petroleum, pitch, and sulfur. Others whisper of saltpeter, quicklime, or even something lost to time entirely. Whatever it was It burned with an unearthly fury. It clung to ships, to armor, even to water itself, flames that no amount of dousing could quench. When the Arab fleet advanced upon the city, the Byzantines struck, from the prows of their warships, and from the mouths of dragon-headed siphons mounted on their walls. They hurled torrents of liquid fire. Great sheets of flame arced across the sea, turning wooden vessels into blazing infernos. Sailors leaped into the waves, only to find the fire followed them, floating and spreading across the water like a living beast. Panic swept the Arab navy. Whole squadrons were annihilated, their ships consumed in seconds. The sea itself seemed to burn, and the survivors carried back tales of a Christian weapon forged in hell. The Byzantines, too, saw it as divine providence, a heavenly miracle granted to save God's chosen city. The siege dragged on for years, but the Arabs could not break Constantinople. Its walls, its defenders, and its terrible fire held firm. In 678 CE, after years of failure and devastating losses, the Arabs withdrew. Constantinople had survived. This was not just a military victory, was a salvation. For the first time in decades, the Byzantines had not only resisted the tide of Islam, but had struck it back. Across the empire, bells rang and prayers soared. Emperor Constantine IV was hailed as a new Constantine, the protector of Christendom. But though the empire rejoiced, all knew the danger was not gone. The Arabs had been repelled, not destroyed. They would return, and with them would come even greater storms. Constantinople stood, yes, but the Byzantines understood now that their survival would depend not only on walls of stone, but on cunning, diplomacy, and the fire that burned the sea. The empire was alive, but the world around it was changing faster than any emperor could control. New enemies stirred on the northern steppes. Old rivals in the west plotted, and within the empire itself, faith and politics threatened to tear it apart. And so the Byzantines faced a haunting question: could Constantinople remain eternal when all the world sought its fall? Chapter 12. The Iconoclasts' War Within the Empire. The survival of Constantinople, in 678 CE, was a triumph that resounded across Christendom. The mighty walls, the resilience of its people, and the unearthly fury of Greek fire had turned back the seemingly unstoppable tide of the Caliphate. But as the Arab fleet smoldered on the waters of the Marmara, another storm was beginning to brew out outside the walls. But within them, it was not a storm of armies or sieges, but of faith, conviction, and bitter division. This storm would be remembered as the Iconoclast controversy, a century-long battle that would pit emperor against pope, soldier against monk, and family against family. It would shake the empire to its very core, and though it began as a theological debate, it quickly grew into something far darker, a war over the soul of Byzantium itself. The seed of conflict in Byzantium. Religion was not merely personal belief, it was politics, identity, and legitimacy. The empire called itself Roman, but it saw itself as Christian Rome, chosen by God to guard the faith. Icons, sacred images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints had long been central to Byzantine worship. They adorned churches, mosaics, and private homes. People prayed before them, kissed them, carried them into battle, and believed them to be conduits of divine power. But some began to question this devotion. Were icons holy reminders or dangerous idols? The Old Testament thundered against graven images, and Islam, Byzantium's new and formidable rival, strictly forbade depictions of the divine. As Arab armies triumphed and Byzantine lands fell, whispers spread. Had God abandoned the empire because of its sin? Was the worship of icons to blame? Into this atmosphere of doubt stepped an emperor who would ignite a fire as destructive as any Arab siege, Leo III, who reigned from 717 to 741. Leo III, and the first wave of iconoclasm. Leo had already proven himself a formidable leader by defeating the massive Arab siege of Constantinople in 717 to 718, again with the aid of Greek fire. But while his military successes secured the city, his gaze turned inward toward what he believed to be spiritual decay. In 726, Leo issued a decree. The veneration of icons was to be forbidden. Almost overnight, icons that had stood for centuries were torn down. Soldiers ripped mosaics from church walls. Paintings were whitewashed. Relics were destroyed, and those who resisted were branded as heretics. Monks, who were among the most devoted to icons, became the heart of the resistance. They preached, wrote, and sometimes died to defend the sacred images. Many were tortured, mutilated, or exiled. The empire split. In the east, Leo's policies found support among soldiers and administrators, but in the west, especially in Rome, the backlash was fierce. The Pope denounced the emperor, widening the ever-growing gulf between Byzantium and the Latin Church. For Byzantines, this was not just about images, it was about power. By attacking icons, Leo challenged the influence of the church and monasteries, bringing them under imperial control. Constantine V, the hammer of the monks, Leo's son. Constantine V, 741 to 775, carried his father's policies further and harsher. Nicknamed Kopernemos, dung-named by his enemies, Constantine was one of the fiercest iconoclast emperors. He convened councils to declare icons heretical, ordered widespread persecutions of monks, and even had some blinded or executed. For Constantine, icons were not just a religious danger, but a political one. Monasteries had grown wealthy and independent, threatening imperial authority. By attacking them under the banner of theology, he weakened their grip and filled the imperial treasury. Yet Constantine was no mere destroyer. Militarily, he was brilliant, winning battles against Bulgars and Arabs. His reign strengthened the empire, but his war on icons left scars deeper than any battlefield. Generations of Byzantines grew up in a divided empire, some worshipping with bare walls, and others clinging to their hidden icons. The return of the icon's iconoclasm might have lasted forever, but history often swings like a pendulum. After Constantine's death, the policy wavered, and in 787, under the rule of Empress Irene, the pendulum swung back. Irene, ruling in the name of her young son Constantine VI, convened the Second Council of Nicaea, which restored the veneration of icons. For the iconules, the defenders of icons, it was a moment of triumph. Churches once stripped bare were filled again with the gleaming faces of saints and mosaics of Christ painted, but the peace would not last. In the early 9th century, a second wave of iconoclasm broke out, this time under Emperor Leo V. Once again, icons were banned, once again monasteries were persecuted, and once again blood was spilled in the name of faith. This cycle of destruction and restoration dragged on until 8, when Empress Theodora finally ended the controversy for good. The day of triumph was marked as the Feast of Orthodoxy, still celebrated in the Eastern Orthodox Church today. Icons had survived, but the empire had been deeply scarred. Wound in Byzantium's sold the iconoclast controversy was not just a religious debate. It was a civil war of the spirit that weakened Byzantium at a time when it could least afford division. While emperors and monks fought over images, the empire's enemies pressed harder at its borders. The Bulgars raided in the north, the Arabs struck from the south, and the Western Pope, alienated by iconoclasm, drifted closer to the rising power of the Franks. Even within Constantinople, unity was shattered. Families were divided between iconoclasts and iconodulous. Some saw the emperors as heretics, others as reformers chosen by God. Trust was eroded, and the Byzantine state, already fragile from war and loss, fractured from within. By the time icons were finally restored, Byzantium had paid dearly. Its people were weary, its church bitterly divided, and its prestige diminished in the Christian world. What had begun as a theological dispute had become a century of chaos that almost unraveled the empire. The suspenseful Hagia Empire had survived the fire of the Arabs and the fire of its own fury over icons. But Byzantium's trials were far from over. Even as the mosaics glittered once more in Hagia Sophia, a new storm gathered beyond the northern frontiers. The steppe riders, fierce and relentless, were on the move. Among them were a people who would carve their name in blood and fear across Byzantine chronicles. The Bulgars would, Byzantium, already scarred from within, withstand the clash of steel and horsemen thundering down from the north. Chapter 13. The Bulgars at the Gates. The mosaics of Hagia Sophia glittered once more, their saints restored to the vaulted domes, in defiance of those who had sought to erase them. Yet outside the great church, in the vast landscapes stretching north of Constantinople, a new threat was on the rise. The century-long struggle over icons had left Byzantium spiritually exhausted, but its enemies had not rested. From the windswept plains of the Balkans, a formidable, people-fierce horsemen, hardened warriors, and cunning kings gathered to test the empire's strength. These were the Bulgars, and their arrival would change the map of Byzantium forever. A new neighbor on the Danube. The Bulgars were not newcomers to the Byzantine world. Since the 7th century, they had ridden down from the Eurasian steppe, a confederation of Turkic and Slavic tribes, fierce and disciplined. They crossed the Danube and carved out their own kingdom on lands that Byzantium had long considered its own. At first, the Byzantines treated them as raiders, barbarians to be bought off with gold or beaten back with armies. But the Bulgars were no fleeting menace. By the time the iconoclast controversy had begun, they had established a permanent state, the First Bulgarian Empire, with its capital at Pliska. From there, they launched repeated raids deep into Thrace, threatening the lifeline of Constantinople itself. The empire, weakened by internal strife, found itself locked in a grim struggle for survival. The hammer falls. Constantine V's war. The emperor, Constantine V, while notorious for his persecution of monks, was also a brilliant general. He recognized the Bulgars as a grave threat and launched no fewer than 9 campaigns against them during his reign. With the disciplined Byzantine army, supported by Greek fire on the rivers and siege engines on land, Constantine inflicted crushing defeats on the Bulgars. One of his greatest victories came at the Battle of Anchialus in 763, where the Bulgars were slaughtered by the tens of thousands. Chroniclers describe the battlefield soaked in blood, Bulgar bodies piled high, and Byzantine soldiers marching triumphantly back to Constantinople. For a time, it seemed Constantine might crush the Bulgar state entirely. Yet despite his victories, the Bulgars endured. Their strength lay not just in open battle, but in their resilience, their ability to retreat into forests, marshes, and mountain strongholds where Byzantine armies could not easily follow. A lurking menace of Constantine's death in 775. The pressure eased, and the Bulgars began to recover. Over the next century, as Byzantium was torn apart by theological disputes and shifting rulers, the Bulgars grew stronger under capable Khans like Krum. Krum was no ordinary warlord. He was a strategist who combined brutality with vision. Under his leadership, the Bulgars expanded, swallowing Slavic tribes and pushing ever closer to Constantinople. He became a name whispered in fear across the empire, a shadow looming beyond the city's golden walls. Krum, the climax, came in the early 9th century. In 800, the Byzantine Emperor Nicephorus I marched north with a massive army to finally crush the Bulgars at their capital, Pliska. At first, Nicephorus was victorious, sacking the Bulgar city and burning it to the ground. But as the emperor celebrated, Krum prepared his trap. On July 26, 811, in the passes of the Balkan Mountains, the Bulgars ambushed the Byzantine army. In a single night, the empire's mightiest force was annihilated. Emperor Nikephoros himself was killed, the first Byzantine emperor to fall in battle in centuries. His skull, Crum ordered, was cleaned, lined with silver, and fashioned into a drinking cup. He raised it at banquets, toasting his triumph with the emperor's hollowed head. This act shocked the empire and cemented Crum's legend as a barbarian overlord. But to his people, he was a unifier, a ruler who had humbled Rome itself. The siege of Constantinople. Crum was not content with victory in the mountains. In 813, he marched south with an enormous force, reinforced by siege engines captured from Byzantium. For the first time since the Arabs, the great city of Constantine once again faced annihilation. Chroniclers described the terror within the city as smoke rose on the horizon, and the thunder of hooves echoed outside the Theodosian walls. Crum's army devastated the countryside, burning villages, enslaving populations, and cutting off supplies. The city braced for the end. But Constantinople's walls, the eternal guardians of the empire, held firm. Greek fire rained down on Bulgar ships, and the defenders repelled every assault. Crum, unable to breach the city, resorted to diplomacy, but when talks broke down, he unleashed another wave of destruction on the surrounding lands. It was only his sudden death in 8, perhaps from a stroke, that saved Byzantium from disaster. With their leader gone, the Bulgars withdrew, and the city once more survived by the narrowest of margins. Byzantium and Bulgaria, an uneasy balance though. Crum's death spared the empire. It did not end the Bulgar threat. For the next century, Byzantium and Bulgaria remained locked in an uneasy dance of war and diplomacy. Sometimes they fought, sometimes they signed treaties, sometimes they but never could. Byzantium forget that too. Its north lay, a rival kingdom, capable of bringing emperors to their knees. The Bulgars would eventually convert to Christianity in the mid-9th century, a transformation that brought them closer to Byzantium culturally, but also intensified their rivalry. The empire would spend centuries trying to dominate or pacify them, with varying success. The suspenseful Hagias, the Bulgar menace, lingered. Byzantium faced yet another trial, not from the plains of the Balkans, but from within the shifting currents of its own palace. Intrigue, assassinations, and palace coups would soon become as dangerous as foreign armies. Among these plots rose a man whose reign would be remembered, not just for its power, but for its sheer brutality. The dark and enigmatic Emperor Basil the Macedonian. Would the empire survive its enemies within, even as it held back its enemies without? Chapter 14. Basil the Macedonian, from stable boy to emperor. The blood of Nikephoros still stained the fields of Plesca, when, decades later, a man of humble birth rose from obscurity to claim the Byzantine throne. His name was Basil, a Macedonian peasant by origin, whose climb from stable boy to emperor would become one of the most astonishing tales in Byzantine history. His reign marked the dawn of a dynasty that would rule for over 2 centuries. A line of emperors who would both elevate and torment the empire. But Basil himself was no ordinary ruler. His ascent was soaked in blood, betrayal, and ambition, traits that would define his reign and leave behind a legacy feared as much as it was admired. From the stables to the palace, Basil's origins were shrouded in mystery. Born around 811 in the Byzantine theme of Macedonia, he was said to come from peasant stock, though later, chroniclers spun tales of noble, Armenian ancestry to elevate his name. What is certain is that Basil began life far from the glittering mosaics of Constantinople. For years he toiled in obscurity, a strong and rugged man whose fortune changed when he entered the service of wealthy patrons. His rise began in the stables, where his physical strength, loyalty, and charisma caught the attention of the powerful. By sheer cunning and talent, Basil wormed his way into the court of Emperor Michael III, known mockingly as Michael the Drunkard. Basil's charm and loyalty earned him the emperor's trust, and soon he became not only Michael's bodyguard, but also his closest companion, Michael III and Basil. Brothers in pleasure. Michael III, indulgent and careless, was everything a Byzantine emperor was not supposed to be. He reveled in games, horse races, and drunken feasts, leaving governance to others. In Basil, he found a partner in his pleasures, someone strong enough to protect him and clever enough to entertain him. But Basil was no mere court jester. While Michael wasted his throne, Basil studied, learned, and calculated. He mastered court politics, built alliances, and won over both nobles and commoners with his charisma. His eyes were always fixed on a prize far greater than favor. He wanted the crown itself. The fall of Theoctistos, uncle, Bardas, and the powerful minister, Theoctistos, effectively ruled the empire, often ignoring the emperor's excesses. Basil saw them as obstacles. In 855, Basil engineered the downfall of Theoctistos, accusing him of treachery. Theoctistos was dragged from the palace and executed. The coup shocked Constantinople. Who was this upstart Macedonian stable boy who dared to topple one of the empire's most powerful men? But Basil's influence only grew. By 866, he was crowned co-emperor alongside Michael III, a move that baffled many. How could a peasant-born outsider rise so high? The answer lay in Basil's ruthless ambition. Brother turned murderer, but Basil's rise was not complete. Co-emperor was not enough. He wanted the throne for himself. And so, in 867, in a chilling act of betrayal, Basil murdered his benefactor and friend, Emperor Michael III. In his bedchamber, chroniclers record the gruesome night. Basil, once Michael's drinking companion, entered the room with conspirators and fell upon the emperor. Michael's screams echoed through the palace as his blood stained the marble floors. With his death, Basil secured what he had long coveted, the sole throne of Byzantium. Thus ended the reign of Michael the Drunkard. Thus began the reign of Basil the Macedonian. Basil, the first emperor, at last as emperor. Basil sought to wash away the stain of his treachery by portraying himself as a defender of the faith and restorer of order. He supported the church, patronized art and learning, and re-established discipline in the court. His reign would mark the beginning of what historians call the Macedonian Renaissance, a golden age of culture, law, and military revival. Yet beneath the polished veneer of a pious and just ruler lingered the shadow of his rise. Basil ruled with the cold calculation of a man who had betrayed his closest ally. He never forgot that the throne of Constantinople was both the greatest seat of power and the deadliest trap. A dynasty born in blood. Basil, I founded the Macedonian dynasty, which would rule Byzantium for nearly 2 centuries. Under their leadership, the empire would see a resurgence of strength, reclaiming lands, codifying laws, and producing some of the most brilliant cultural achievements in Byzantine history. But the dynasty's roots lay in betrayal. Every triumph, every glittering mosaic, every victory on the battlefield carried the echo of that night in 867, when Basil raised his hand against Michael. The suspenseful hook. Yet Basil's reign was only the beginning. His heirs would inherit both his strength and his sins. Among them would rise an emperor whose cruelty earned him the name, the Bulgar Slayer, a man whose reign would bring both glory and terror to Byzantium. The question loomed: could a dynasty born in treachery truly lead the empire into greatness, or would it forever be haunted by the blood spilled to claim the throne? Chapter 15. Basil II, the Bulgar Slayer. The throne of Constantinople had been bathed in blood more than once, and when Basil II inherited it, many thought he would be no different from his forebears, just another pawn in the endless intrigues of the Byzantine court. But history would prove them wrong. For Basil II was not merely an emperor. He was a warlord, a man of iron resolve, who ruled longer than almost any other Byzantine sovereign. His reign was one of brutality and brilliance, conquest and cruelty. and it would be his savage war against the Bulgarians that earned him his infamous title, the Bulgar Slayer. A boy surrounded by vultures. Basil, too, was born in 958, the son of Emperor Romanos II, and a descendant of Basil the Macedonian. Yet when Romanos died suddenly in 963, Basil was still a child, barely old enough to grasp the weight of empire. Regents quickly took control. Among them his mother, Theophano, beautiful, cunning, and ruthless, whose name was whispered in connection with the mysterious death of her husband. The court of Constantinople, seethed with ambition. Generals, courtiers, and nobles circled like vultures, waiting to devour the throne. Basil grew up in this pit of treachery, watching men rise and fall, their lives snuffed out by daggers or poison. From this dangerous childhood, he learned the harshest lesson of all: trust no one. The shadow of generals, too powerful men, soon dominated Basil's early reign. Nikephoros, II Phocas, the great general who married Basil's mother and seized the crown, and later John Zimisces, another brilliant commander who betrayed and murdered Nikephoros to take power for himself. For years, Basil watched as these generals led the empire to victory abroad, while he remained a puppet in their shadow. He seethed with resentment. The boy emperor longed for the day when he would cast aside the puppeteers and rule alone, taking the reins. That day finally came in 976, when John Zimisces died. At last, Basil II was sole emperor, but his troubles were only beginning. The empire's aristocrats and generals still considered him a weak figurehead, untested in battle, and unsuited for rule. They whispered that he was dour, unsmiling, a man more comfortable in armor than in silk, and perhaps they were right. Basil despised the luxury of the palace. He rejected courtly pleasures, preferring the rigors of the military camp, while his predecessors reveled in feasts and theater. Basil lived like a soldier: simple food, long campaigns, and endless training. His true throne was not the golden dais of Constantinople, but the saddle of a warhorse. The rebellion of Bardas Skleros and Bardas Faxil. Most immediately, Basil's authority was challenged. Two powerful generals, Bardas Skleros and Bardas Phocas, rebelled against him, plunging the empire into civil war. For years, battles raged across Asia Minor as Basil fought to assert his control. At first, the rebels nearly triumphed. Basil's armies faltered, his authority seemed doomed, but the emperor refused to yield. He hardened himself in the fires of war, learning tactics, strategy, and the harsh discipline of command. With the help of the Varangian Guard, his fearsome band of axe-wielding Norse mercenaries, Basil crushed the rebellions. By 989, his rivals lay dead, and the emperor stood supreme. It was a baptism of fire. The boy who had once been overshadowed by generals was now the master of all generals. The war against Bulgaria with his throne secure, Basil turned to his greatest challenge, the Bulgarian Empire. For decades, the Bulgarians under their powerful Tsar Samuel had been the terror of the Balkans, raiding deep into Byzantine lands, seizing fortresses, and humiliating the empire. Basil swore vengeance. For nearly 40 years, he waged a relentless war against the Bulgarians, a campaign of attrition that tested the endurance of both empires. He rebuilt the Byzantine army, hardened it into a machine of conquest, and personally led his troops into battle year after year. Tsar Samuel proved a worthy adversary, striking with cunning ambushes and guerrilla tactics. The war seesawed back and forth, each side winning victories and suffering defeats. But Basil would not rest until Bulgaria was utterly destroyed. The horror of Clydiante, turning point, came in 1014 at the Battle of Cleidion. Basil's forces trapped Samuel's army in a mountain pass, encircling them with iron discipline. The Bulgarians fought desperately but were overwhelmed. Tens of thousands were captured, and it was here that Basil earned his name, the Bulgar Slayer. Chroniclers say he ordered the blinding of 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners, sparing only one in every 100, who was left with a single eye to guide the others back home. When the blinded soldiers stumbled into Samuel's camp, the sight was so horrific that the Tsar suffered a heart attack and died soon after. The tale of Cledion spread like wildfire, striking terror into the hearts of Byzantium's enemies. Whether every detail was true or not, the message was clear. Basil II was merciless, triumph and terror. After Samuel's death, Bulgarian resistance crumbled. By 1018, Bulgaria was fully annexed into the Byzantine Empire, its proud kingdom reduced to a province. Basil had achieved what no emperor before him had managed, the complete destruction of the Bulgarian state, but his triumph came at a terrible cost. Generations of soldiers had perished in his endless wars, villages lay in ruin, and the Balkans were drenched in blood. Basil himself became a figure of awe and fear, a ruler who seemed less a man than a force of iron will. Basil's final years. Basil II ruled for nearly 50 years, longer than almost any other Byzantine emperor. He never married, never took a mistress, never allowed himself the luxury of heirs or family. His life was war. His children were the empire's armies. When he died in 1025, he left Byzantium larger, stronger, and more secure than it had been in centuries. But he also left behind a dynasty weakened by his failure to produce an heir. His successors lacked his strength, and soon the empire would drift back into decline. The suspenseful Hook Basil II's reign was both the zenith and the curse of Byzantium. He was the empire's hammer, the warlord who crushed its enemies and carved his name into history with blood. Yet the shadow of his cruelty haunted the empire long after his death, and as the years passed, a new storm gathered on the horizon, the rise of the Seljuk Turks, a threat unlike any the Byzantines had ever faced. Their clash would culminate in one of the most disastrous battles in medieval history. Chapter 16. The Battle of Manzikert, the day Byzantium shattered. The death of Basil II in 1025 had left the Byzantine Empire at its height, wealthy, vast, and seemingly unshakable. But appearances can deceive. Beneath the gilded surface of Constantinople's glory, cracks had already begun to spread. Weak rulers squandered the inheritance of the Bulgar slayer. Court intrigues sapped the throne of authority, and generals pursued their own ambitions rather than the empire's survival. By the mid-11th century, a new enemy had risen in the east, the Seljuk Turks, fierce nomadic warriors from the steppes. They had embraced Islam and carved out a vast domain stretching from Persia toward the borders of Byzantium. Their lightning raids threatened Asia Minor, the very heartland of the empire, and it was here, on a dusty plain near the fortress of Manzikert, in 1071, that Byzantium's destiny would be shattered. A weakening empire after Basil II's death, Byzantium's throne passed through a succession of emperors who lacked his iron discipline. Aristocrats grew fat with wealth, soldiers grew lazy, and the once mighty armies of Constantinople began to wither. The Byzantine military machine, once the envy of the world, was hollowed out by corruption and neglect. Peasants who had long served as the backbone of the army were stripped of their lands by greedy mechstes, leaving fewer men to fight. Mercenaries, loyal only to their pay, replaced disciplined native soldiers. Into this decaying empire marched Romanos for Diogenes, a soldier emperor who took the throne in 1068. Unlike many of his predecessors, Romanos was no pampered courtier. He understood that the empire faced a crisis, and he resolved to meet it with steel. The Seljuk threat, the Seljuk Turks, under their cunning Sultan Alp Arslan, were unlike the foes Byzantium had faced before. They were masters of mounted warfare, striking swiftly with horse archers before vanishing into the mountains and plains. Their tactics frustrated the slow-moving Byzantine armies, accustomed to set-piece battles. By 1071, Seljuk raids had pushed deep into Asia Minor, burning villages, seizing fortresses, and shaking the empire's hold on its eastern provinces. Romanos knew he had to act decisively, or risk losing the very lands that sustained Byzantium's power. The march to Med gathered one of the largest armies Byzantium had fielded in decades, perhaps 40,000 to 70,000 men, though the numbers are uncertain. It was a patchwork host: seasoned Byzantine troops, mercenaries from across Europe and the Middle East, and the elite Varangian Guard, fierce warriors from the north wielding axes taller than a man. But cracks showed even before the campaign began. Romanos's generals despised him, especially Andronikos Doukas, a member of the powerful Doukas family, who plotted against the emperor. The army that marched east was already divided by jealousy and treachery. In August 1071, Romanos advanced toward the fortress of Manzikert, a strategic stronghold in eastern Anatolia. His goal was to secure it and push the Seljuks back. But Alp Arslan, learning of the emperor's approach, rushed north with his own army. The two great forces met on the plain outside Manzikert, and fate itself seemed to hold its breath. The battle unfolds on August 26, 1071. The Byzantines and Seljuks clashed. The day began with cautious maneuvering. Romanos arranged his army in traditional formation: infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings, and mercenaries at the rear. Alp Arslan, clad in white robes of humility, prayed before battle and entrusted his fate to God. Then he unleashed the full fury of the Seljuk horse archers. Wave after wave of arrows rained down on the Byzantines, disrupting their lines. The Turks feigned retreats, luring Byzantine cavalry into traps. Dust filled the air, and confusion spread through the ranks. Romanos fought bravely, trying to rally his men. But as evening fell, disaster struck. The emperor ordered a controlled withdrawal to regroup for the night. Misinterpreting the signal, parts of the Byzantine army panicked and fled. And then came the final betrayal. Andronikos Doukas, who commanded the reserve, refused to support the emperor. Instead, he spread the lie that Romanos had been slain. Believing their leader dead, the Byzantines broke. The army disintegrated into chaos. The Seljuks struck like wolves among sheep. The proud Byzantine host was annihilated, its soldiers cut down or captured. The emperor in chains amid the carnage. Romanos IV fought desperately, wielding his sword until he was overwhelmed. Captured by Seljuk soldiers, he was brought before Alp Arslan, the Sultan, expecting to see a trembling monarch, instead found a battle-worn warrior. Legend says Alp Arslan placed his foot on Romanos's neck, but then, struck by the emperor's dignity, lifted him up and treated him with unexpected respect. "Had I captured you in arrogance," the Sultan said, "I would have slain you. But since I have taken you in humility, I will spare you." Romanos was eventually released after agreeing to humiliating terms, but his fate was sealed. Returning to Byzantium, he was overthrown by his rivals, blinded, and left to die in agony. His sacrifice for the empire unrewarded. The aftermath: defeat at Manzikert was more than a lost battle, it was a catastrophe. The Byzantine army was shattered, its reputation destroyed, and its hold on Asia Minor fatally weakened. Turkish tribes swept into the region almost unopposed, seizing fertile lands that had been the empire's lifeblood for centuries. Within a generation, most of Anatolia was lost. Byzantium, once a mighty superpower, staggered under the weight of defeat, and though it would endure for centuries more, the empire would never again recover its full strength. The suspenseful, hooked Battle of Manzikert marked the beginning of Byzantium's long decline, a wound from which it never fully healed. Yet, even in its darkest hour, the empire clung to survival, turning to desperate measures, including calling for help from the West, and that cry for aid would unleash a storm that neither East nor West could foresee: the Crusades. Chapter 17. The First Crusade, and Byzantium, allies or enemies. The dust of Manzikert still haunted the empire. Asia Minor, once the breadbasket and backbone of Byzantine power, had slipped into the grasp of the Seljuk Turks. Fortress after fortress fell. Villages that had once paid their taxes to Constantinople now offered tribute to the Sultan of Rum. The empire was shrinking, its armies broken, its nobles divided. But Byzantium was not yet dead. Its rulers, desperate for salvation, looked westward to a land they had long despised, mistrusted, and mocked. And from the west came an answer, though it would prove a double-edged sword. The First Crusade, a cry for helping 1081. The throne of Byzantium passed to a man unlike any who had worn the purple in generations. Alexios, the first Komnenos, a soldier of cunning intellect and boundless energy. Alexios inherited an empire in ruins. Seljuk horsemen roamed freely through Anatolia. Normans under Robert Guiscard threatened Byzantium's western frontiers, and the empire's treasury was empty. Alexios knew he could not restore Byzantium with Byzantine forces alone. His army was too small, his resources too few. So, in 1095, he sent envoys to the west with a desperate plea. Send warriors to aid us against the Turks. At the Council of Clermont that same year, Pope Urban II seized upon Alexius's request, but twisted it into something far greater. The Pope called upon the Knights of Christendom to march east, not simply to aid Byzantium, but to liberate Jerusalem from the infidel. What Alexios had hoped for was mercenaries. What he received was a tidal wave of fanaticism. The armies of Christendom, by 1096, the roads of Europe shook with the tramp of countless feet. Knights in shining mail, peasants with little more than pitchforks, and zealots consumed with visions of holy war, all flocked eastward. Entire families abandoned their homes, convinced God himself demanded they reclaim the Holy Land. But the march east was chaos. The so-called People's Crusade, led by the preacher, Peter the Hermit, stumbled into Asia Minor ill-prepared and was annihilated by the Turks. Yet behind them came a far more dangerous force, the great barons and knights of Europe. Men like Bohemond of Taranto, the Norman warlord, Godfrey of Bouillon, a devout yet ruthless knight, and Raymond of Toulouse, a hardened veteran. These were not men Alexios could command easily. Each sought land, glory, or eternal salvation, and they arrived in Constantinople in numbers Byzantium had not seen in centuries. Tension in Constantinople. Imagine the scene. Tens of thousands of armored warriors camped outside the walls of Constantinople, their banners fluttering, their swords gleaming. The citizens of the empire gazed upon them with awe and fear. These were barbarians, men of the West whom the Byzantines considered crude and uncivilized. Yet they were also deadly, disciplined, and utterly fanatical. Alexios played a dangerous game. He welcomed the Crusaders as allies, but demanded oaths of loyalty. Each baron swore to return any captured Byzantine land to the empire. Some swore reluctantly, others with hidden treachery. The tension was palpable. The Byzantines mistrusted the Crusaders' greed. The Crusaders despised what they saw as Byzantine arrogance. Yet, for a moment, their fates were entwined. Victory in Asia Minor, with Byzantine guidance and Crusader steel, the war turned. The Seljuk Turks, long thought invincible, suffered crushing defeats. The great city of Nicaea, once lost, surrendered back into Byzantine hands in 1097. Roads, that had been silent for decades now, echoed once more with Byzantine patrols. For Alexios, this was salvation. The empire regained vital footholds in Asia Minor. The Crusaders, for their part, pressed deeper into Turkish lands, carving a bloody path toward Syria and Palestine. But already cracks appeared. At Antioch, when the Crusaders seized the city in 1098, they refused to hand it back to Byzantium as promised. Instead, Bohemond declared himself Prince of Antioch, betraying his oath. The uneasy alliance between Byzantium and the Crusaders began to sour. The fall of Jerusalem in 1099. The Crusaders reached their ultimate goal, Jerusalem. After a brutal siege, the holy city fell to their swords. What followed was a massacre so savage that even chroniclers of the time recoiled in horror. Streets ran red with blood. Muslim, Jew, even Eastern Christians were cut down in the frenzy. The Crusaders had achieved their miracle, but Byzantium had gained little. Jerusalem did not return to imperial hands. Instead, it became the capital of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. A bitter victory for Byzantium. The First Crusade was both triumph and tragedy. On one hand, the empire had recovered crucial territories in Asia Minor, thanks to Alexius's cunning. On the other, the arrival of the Crusaders had unleashed a storm the emperor could not control. The West had tasted blood and conquest in the East. They had seen the wealth of Byzantium and the riches of the Levant, and many whispered that Constantinople itself, jewel of Christendom, might one day be theirs. Suspenseful hook, the First Crusade had saved Byzantium from immediate destruction, but it had planted the seeds of a deeper doom. The West, once distant, was now entangled in the East, and those entanglements would grow into rivalries, betrayals, and wars. Ahead lay darker chapters still, when the very allies Byzantium had summoned would one day turn their swords against Constantinople itself. Chapter 18. Byzantium and the later Crusades, from uneasy allies to bitter foes. The banners of the First Crusade still fluttered in memory, but the alliance that had once saved Byzantium was already crumbling. The West had seen the East, and the East had seen the West, and neither liked what it found. For Alexios Komnenos, the First Crusade was a gamble that had preserved the empire, but the generations that followed would reveal the true cost. The Crusades, once called in the name of Christ, would become a weapon that threatened Byzantium itself. The Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149 A. Broken promise. Half a century after the fall of Jerusalem, the West came east again. This time it was the kings themselves, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, leading armies of glittering knights. Their goal, to protect the Crusader states carved out in the Holy Land, which were under threat from rising Muslim power. But for Byzantium, the Second Crusade brought little but trouble. When the vast Crusader armies reached Constantinople, Emperor Manuel I Komnenos faced the same dilemma as Alexios before him. He welcomed them as allies, yet the relationship soured almost instantly. The Crusaders accused the Byzantines of treachery, of hoarding supplies, of being too friendly with the Turks. Manuel, for his part, saw them as unruly barbarians who trampled his lands, disrespected his authority, and endangered his fragile diplomacy with the Islamic world. The crusade itself ended in disaster. After months of wandering, starving, and bickering, the Crusader armies were smashed in Anatolia and Syria. Byzantium, though spared outright destruction, found its reputation further poisoned in Western eyes. The Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192. Kings and emperors. If the Second Crusade was a farce, the Third Crusade was a storm. Its cause, the fall of Jerusalem in 1187 to the great Muslim general Saladin. This time the mightiest monarchs of the West marched east. Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Their armies were vast, their ambition boundless. Byzantium, however, was no longer under the Komnenoi, but the Angelos dynasty, whose weakness and corruption sapped the empire's strength. Emperor Isaac II Angelos feared the Western kings as much as the Muslims. Suspicion ran high. When Frederick Barbarossa's massive German army crossed Byzantine lands, Isaac hesitated between alliance and betrayal. At times, he aided the Germans. At times, he secretly dealt with Saladin to hinder them. The Germans marched through regardless, though Barbarossa himself drowned in a river before reaching the Holy Land. The crusade ended in stalemate. Richard the Lionheart won glory, but Jerusalem remained under Muslim rule. Byzantium, meanwhile, had alienated both East and West, seeds of doom by the late 12th century. The dream of unity between Byzantium and the Crusaders had utterly withered. In Western eyes, Byzantium was a decadent empire of schemers who betrayed Christendom for their own gain. In Byzantine eyes, the Crusaders were greedy invaders, cloaked in the guise of holy warriors. The truth was harsher still. The empire was weak, its armies dwindling, its court torn by intrigue, and the West, powerful and ambitious, began to see Constantinople itself as a prize. The Fourth Crusade, 1204. The unthinkable then came the unthinkable. Called originally to reclaim Jerusalem, the Fourth Crusade was diverted by Venetian merchants and ambitious barons. In 1203, Crusader ships carried armies, not to the Holy Land, but to Constantinople itself. At first, they claimed to come as allies, to place a friendly emperor upon the throne. But soon, greed, mistrust, and vengeance consumed them. In April 1204, the greatest city in Christendom fell not to Turk or Arab, but to fellow Christians. The Crusaders stormed Constantinople's walls, looted its treasures, and desecrated its churches. For 3 days, the jewel of Byzantium was consumed in fire and blood. Relics were stolen, icons shattered, and ancient manuscripts destroyed. The Latin Empire of Constantinople was declared, and Byzantium was shattered into fragments. Suspenseful hook, the First Crusade had saved Byzantium. The Fourth had nearly destroyed it. What began as an alliance and desperation had ended in betrayal and conquest. Yet, Byzantium, though broken, was not dead. In exile, emperors would rise again. Provinces would resist. The empire's flame, though faint, still flickered in the shadows of defeat. The question was no longer whether Byzantium could survive its enemies, but whether it could survive itself. Chapter 19. The Latin Occupation and the Fragmented Empire, 1204 to 1261. The fall of Constantinople in 1204 was a wound so deep that it seemed Byzantium might never recover. For nearly 1,000 years, the city had stood as the beating heart of the empire, fortress of faith, wealth, and culture. But when the smoke cleared after the Fourth Crusade, Constantinople was no longer Byzantine. It was Latin, the Latin Empire, a crown of ashes. Crusaders who had breached the walls declared a new state, the Latin Empire of Constantinople. A Western emperor sat on the Byzantine throne, crowned not in the glittering traditions of the Eastern Church, but under the auspices of Rome. The Venetians, who had orchestrated much of the diversion, seized the lion's share of spoils, ports, islands, and treasures shipped back to Venice. Yet the Latin conquerors soon discovered that wearing Byzantium's crown was far easier than ruling its people. The Latin Empire was a hollow shell. Its leaders, hardened knights from France and Flanders, had no grasp of Byzantine traditions, no understanding of its administration, and no loyalty from its orthodox subjects. The empire they ruled was not a unified state, but a city and a handful of surrounding lands, besieged on all sides. The Byzantine successor states, phoenixes, in exile though Constantinople had fallen. Byzantium itself had not been extinguished. Across the shattered empire, loyalists fled and regrouped, establishing rival courts that claimed to be the true heirs of Rome. 3 successor states emerged. The Empire of Nicaea, founded by Theodore I. This state in western Anatolia became the strongest Byzantine remnant, with a functioning government and a line of capable rulers. Nicaea preserved Byzantine traditions and plotted to reclaim the capital. The Empire of Trebizond, on the Black Sea coast. The Komnenoid dynasty established a small but prosperous state. Though distant and often isolated, Trebizond would endure for centuries. The Despotate of Epirus. In Greece, another fragment of the empire rallied under Greek rulers, balancing between independence and loyalty to the Byzantine legacy. Each of these states dreamed of restoring Byzantium, but their rivalries nearly doomed them all. The Orthodox versus the Latin Church. If political rivalry weakened Byzantium, religious hatred poisoned its soul. The sack of Constantinople had deepened the rift between the Orthodox East and the Catholic West into an abyss. The Orthodox clergy branded the Latins as heretics and desecrators. The people whispered of atrocities, altars defiled, relics stolen, monasteries torched. In return, the Latins treated the Greeks with contempt, imposing Roman Catholic bishops and demanding loyalty to the Pope. What might have been an uneasy coexistence became instead an occupation defined by mistrust, resistance, and rebellion. The rise of Nicaeas. The Latin Empire stumbled. The Empire of Nicaea grew. Under Theodore Lascaris and his successors, it became a beacon for Byzantine refugees. Its armies strengthened, its treasury filled, and its scholars preserved the old traditions of Constantinople. Nicaea became, in every sense but geography, the Byzantine Empire in exile. Its rulers bided their time, knowing that the Latins in Constantinople were weak and divided. The road to recovery. By the mid-13th century, the balance of power shifted. The Latins had lost much of their territory and struggled even to defend Constantinople itself. Meanwhile, Nicaea expanded across Anatolia and into Europe, bringing Epirus and other rivals under its influence. The decisive moment came under Michael VIII Palaiologos, a cunning and ambitious general who seized power in Nicaea in 1259. He understood that Byzantium's survival required not just military strength but careful diplomacy with the right powers and manipulation of the fractured Latin states. In 1261, fortune finally turned. Anikayan General Alexios Strategopoulos led a daring strike on Constantinople, while the Latin garrison was absent. To the astonishment of the world, the city was retaken almost without a fight. The Byzantine flag once again flew over the Hagia Sophia. The Latin Empire was dead. The Byzantine Empire, though battered and diminished, was reborn. Suspenseful hookbutt. This was not a triumphant restoration, it was a resurrection into weakness. The Constantinople of 1261 was not the dazzling city of Justinian or Basil II, but a scarred ruin, depopulated and plundered. The empire Michael VIII reclaimed was not the sprawling dominion of old, but a fragile state surrounded by enemies and haunted by its own decline. The Latins had left scars that could never fully heal, and now a new shadow loomed in the east. The Mongols, the Turks, and the relentless tide of history. Would Byzantium's rebirth be its salvation or merely the prelude to its final, inevitable fall? Chapter 20. The Palaiologan Dynasty and the Long Decline. 1261 to 1453. The reconquest of Constantinople in 1261 should have been a moment of triumphant restoration, of phoenix rising from ashes. Yet, when Michael VIII Palaiologos entered the battered city, he found not the shining jewel of Justinian's age, but a ghost of an empire. The Hagia Sophia, once crowned with gold mosaics, stood in ruin. Entire districts had been abandoned, streets choked with weeds, and much of the population gone, carried into slavery or exile after the Latin sack. Byzantium had returned to its capital, but it returned weakened, scarred, and vulnerable. This final era of Byzantium, the Palaiologan dynasty, would stretch nearly 2 centuries. It was a period of fleeting brilliance, but relentless decline, marked by internal strife, desperate diplomacy, and the encroaching shadow of the Ottoman Turks. Michael VIII, Palaiologos, savior, and usurper Michael VIII, styled himself as the savior of Byzantium. He repaired the city's walls, restored churches, and sought to revive the empire's prestige. But his rise to power came at a cost. To secure his throne, he ordered the blinding of the legitimate heir, the young John IV, Lascaris, a deed that horrified the Orthodox Church and tainted his legacy. Abroad, Michael faced constant threats. The Latin states in Greece plotted revenge. Venice, enraged at losing Constantinople, clashed with Genoa, whom Michael allied with. The Mongols pressed from the east. To safeguard Byzantium, Michael pursued a desperate gamble. He sought union with the Catholic Church to gain Western aid. In 1274, at the Council of Lyon, he formally acknowledged the Pope's supremacy. But this union of the churches was despised by the Orthodox clergy and people, who saw it as betrayal. Riots erupted, monks cursed the emperor, and many branded him a heretic. Michael's attempt at diplomacy alienated his subjects without securing meaningful Western aid. Andronikos II, an empire crumbling Michael's son, Andronikos II Palaiologos, inherited a throne but not the strength to hold it. He reversed his father's pro-Western policy, restoring Orthodoxy's independence, but in his long reign, 1282 to 1328, the empire's weakness became painfully clear. The Byzantine navy, once a terror of the Mediterranean, was disbanded to save money. With no fleet, the empire became helpless before Venetian and Genoese ships, who carved up its trade routes. Worse still, the Turks' newcomers from Central Asia poured into Asia Minor, the once great Byzantine heartland. The breadbasket and recruitment ground of the empire was steadily overrun. One city after another fell to the advancing Ottomans, a rising Turkish dynasty that would soon dominate the region. By the time Andronikos died, Byzantium had lost almost all of Asia Minor. Constantinople still glittered, but it was now a hollow capital with little land to sustain it. Civil wars and dynastic struggles as Byzantium shrank. It turned on itself. In the 14th century, the empire was torn by civil wars between rival emperors and factions. Andronikos II versus Andronikos III. Grandfather and grandson fought a bitter struggle for the throne, plunging the empire into chaos. The Civil War of 1341 to 1347, a brutal conflict between John V Palaiologos and John VI Kantakouzenos, devastated the empire, inviting foreign powers to intervene. During these wars, Byzantium turned to outsiders for help. Serbs, Bulgarians, Venetians, and even Turks were invited in as allies. Each time, Byzantium paid with land, money, or concessions. Each war left the empire weaker than before. The Black Death, as if war and decline were not enough. The mid-14th century brought catastrophe from beyond human control. The Black Death swept through Constantinople, killing perhaps half its population. The empire's already fragile economy and military were shattered. Churches filled with the dead, streets lay silent, and hope seemed to vanish. The rise of the Ottomans. While Byzantium crumbled, the Ottoman Turks surged. Under leaders like Osmani and Orhan, they built a disciplined, expanding state. By 1354, they had crossed into Europe, capturing Gallipoli, giving them a permanent foothold on the continent. From there, they advanced relentlessly into the Balkans. Byzantium, too weak to resist, became little more than a pawn. Its emperors often traveled to Western courts, begging for aid, offering church union in exchange for soldiers. But Western kings saw Byzantium as a relic of the past, useful, perhaps, but doomed. John V, and the humiliation of Byzantium, perhaps no reign better symbolized Byzantium's humiliation than that of John V, Palaiologos 1354 to 1391. Desperate to preserve his throne, he traveled to Rome in 1369, where he publicly converted to Catholicism, pledging loyalty to the Pope. It was a humiliating spectacle. The Emperor of Byzantium, once master of Christendom, kneeling before a foreign pontiff. Yet even this sacrifice brought little help. Western armies never came in the numbers Byzantium needed. The empire remained dependent on the mercy of the Ottomans, who exacted tribute and demanded submission. The last desperate centuries. By the 15th century, Byzantium was no longer an empire in truth. It was a city-state, controlling little more than Constantinople, and a few outlying territories like the Despotate of Morea in Greece. Its emperors still wore the crown of Constantine, still processed through the Hagia Sophia, still claimed to be Roman emperors, but it was a hollow illusion. The Ottomans surrounded the empire on all sides. Their armies, equipped with gunpowder weapons and disciplined were unlike anything Byzantium could resist. The fall of Constantinople, the final act, came under Constantine the 11th Palaeologos, the last emperor. In 1453, Mehmed II, the Ottoman Sultan, known as the Conqueror, marched on Constantinople with a massive army. He brought with him enormous cannons, some of the largest the world had ever seen, designed to smash through the Theodosian walls that had stood for 1,000 years. For 7 weeks, the city held out. Priests led processions around the Hagia Sophia. Defenders vastly outnumbered, patched crumbling walls, and fought with desperate courage. Latin mercenaries fought alongside Greeks in a last show of unity. On May 29, 1453, the walls were finally breached. The Ottomans poured into the city. Constantine the 11th is said to have thrown off his imperial regalia and charged into battle, never to be seen again. The Byzantine Empire was no more. The legacy of Byzantium, though its empire fell, Byzantium's legacy endured. Its scholars fled west, carrying ancient Greek manuscripts that helped ignite the Renaissance. Its Orthodox faith lived on in Russia, Serbia, and Greece. Its art, its mosaics, its architecture, most of all the Hagia Sophia remained monuments to a civilization that had bridged antiquity and the medieval world. The Byzantines had called themselves Romans, heirs to an empire that once ruled the known world. In the end, they were the last guardians of Rome's flame. Suspenseful hook, yet the story of Byzantium does not end with its fall. For centuries, its memory haunted Europe. Its legacy shaped nations, faiths, and empires. And in the echo of its collapse lies a timeless question. How can a civilization so mighty, so enduring, vanish into the shadows of history? You've just witnessed another chapter from the shadows of our past. The world of emperors, kingdoms, and forgotten civilizations hides secrets that still echo today. If you enjoyed this journey into the darker side of history, make sure to hit that subscribe button, tap the bell icon, and join us every week as we uncover more mysteries from the ancient world. This is Dark History, where the past refuses to stay buried. See you in the next story.